All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Byzantine Scotist. Today we have a different discussion than we usually do, but I think a really fascinating and important discussion today. So I have with me Dr. Douglas Petrovich and Peter Brummel of the YouTube channel Paleologos, and we're going to be discussing the archaeology of the pre-Abrahamic period of biblical history. Dr. Petrovich got his PhD in Syro-Palestinian archaeology from the University of Toronto and is now a professor online at Brooks Bible College. And he's done a lot of really excellent research into this period of world history from a biblical perspective. And in addition, he's also authored 2 books so far. He has a book called The World's Oldest Alphabet on early Hebrew inscriptions. And he actually argues that Hebrew is the oldest alphabetical language in the world in that book. He also has another book called The Origin of the Hebrews, if I remember correctly is the name, which is on the evidence of Israelite sojourn within Egypt in the 400-year period. Where the Israelites lived in Egypt. Both very wonderful books. If you'd like to purchase those books, you can do best by contacting Dr. Petrovich directly, and he can either put you in touch with the publisher or sell you a copy directly, because that's how you can get the best price and he gets the best royalties as well. So welcome to the show, Dr. Petrovich. And before we start, is there anything else you would like to bring up?
Yeah, before we kind of get into the history, there's just one thing on my heart that I'd like to put out there, and it's related to how we hold on to the views that we have chosen to embrace. And I've seen a lot of, having taught for over 3 decades, I've seen a lot of students taking different approaches. But I'm very concerned when I see, especially controversial views or views with maybe not as much evidence that are kind of embraced. And what it comes down to is this. I think there's an important need that we have to put our views on trial. And what does that mean? It means on whatever subject where there's disagreement, that I don't just uncritically reject carte blanche the other opposing view or other views that are out there and embrace mine without being willing to really to look at all of the issues and all of the evidence to see if the evidence presents itself to support that. And a good example of this in our day today, just several days ago, the man accused of killing the young people in Idaho, he was extradited from Pennsylvania and brought back to Idaho to face the charges there. He's going to eventually, hopefully, sit or stand in front of a jury, and the investigators, the FBI and other investigators who have put together the evidence are going to present the evidence against him, and they're going to try to persuade, we would think, 12 jurors that he's guilty of these charges, and here's all of the evidence that it takes. So what it comes down to is that the 12 jurors, their approach has to be, we're going to be as objective as humanly possible. We're not going to assume he's guilty. We're not going to assume he's innocent. We're just going to hear all the evidence. And wherever the evidence leads us, that's where we're going to go. So if they walk in there with preconceived ideas and pre-conclusions, then, essentially the evidence means nothing to them. So it's really important that we're willing to take our views on issues related to the Bible and put them on trial. And we never need to be afraid to put them on trial, even with important issues. I'm guessing, Gideon, that you and I would have the same passion about the virgin birth of Jesus Christ, that he was born of a woman who had not had relations with a man. Now, that view is really important to the doctrine of the church throughout history and all the way until today. But it's not wrong to ask the question, does the Bible really teach the virgin birth? And at that point, we need to launch into all of the evidence and kind of wade through it and see what it presents and be willing to follow the evidence. Now, on that question, you almost can't answer all of that, all of the aspects of that question unless you really know the issues in Greek and Hebrew, right? So you have to have a rudimentary understanding of Greek and of Hebrew to look at the word alma in Hebrew, and then parthenos in Greek, and make sure that that your understanding, is shaped by the limits of those terms and how they're used in the Hebrew and Greek Bible, and that will help you understand, where the evidence is going. So whatever the issue is, we've got to be willing to put it on trial. A perfect example of this that I experienced recently, there's a guy who contacted me, and I'm contacted now every week, and it's almost every day, literally, by people with comments or questions. And he knew that I believe in what's called a short sojourn, that the Israelites lived in Egypt for 215. I'm sorry, the long sojourn view, that the Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years before the Exodus. And he holds to the view that they were there for 215 years. So he kind of, tried to persuade me that the short sojourn view was right. And I wrote him back and I said, have you read the published article, the peer-reviewed published article that I wrote on this? It's the most extensive published discussion of this topic so far. It's a 2019 article. And by the way, you can get it. You can download it for free from my academia.edu webpage and read it. And I asked him if he had, and he wrote back, and he essentially didn't discuss any of the issues or any of the evidence that I raised in it. In fact, here's what he said. In essentially, he said, the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch are against you. And he said, Josephus and the medieval authorities are against you. And he said, the new chronologies are also against you. And yet you stick to your guns. Okay. Now, think about the evidence here. Moses lived, according to biblical chronology, my view would be that he died by 1406 BC. And if that's true, then he would have written the first 5 books of the Bible. It was 1 in Hebrew, but we view it as 5, the Pentateuch. He would have written it by 1406 BC. So by the end of the 15th century BC, first 5 books of the Bible are already written, right? Now, so what this guy did is he appealed to sources that are over 1,000 years later after Moses. But see, here's the thing. Moses settled the issue in his own writing as a firsthand witness in the 15th century BC. In Exodus 12, 40, and 41. That's where the battle is won or lost. That's what we can call the Crux Passage. The one passage that's authoritative on the issue. Why is it authoritative? Because it's from a first-hand witness who is watching the clock, and the clock strikes at the moment the Israelites leave Egypt. And then we can count back because the Israelites had been counting the time. And it says very clearly that it was 430 years to the very day after, and the implication there is when Jacob brought his family down into Egypt. That's when the Exodus occurred. So the Septuagint, the first 5 books were translated into Greek in the 3rd century BC. The Samaritan Pentateuch, it's disputed as to when it was written, but most likely it dates to the 2nd century BC. Josephus is 1st century AD. Medieval authorities, only a matter of hundreds of years ago. So all of the sources that he's appealing to are sources that are far more recent, no less than 1,000 years after the events themselves happened. And he's appealing to these later sources. But methodologically, that's a terrible place to put all of the weight of your arguments and your view on evidence from 1,000 years later. So, it's all about the weight of the evidence. It's all about your methodology for solving a problem. So what we have to do, Gideon, is this, I think. We have to take our understandings, and in many cases, especially for those of us who've been in the church for a long time, we have to do what I call, we take our Sunday school approach to things and we put it on trial, right? And we say, okay, it's like with me. I was taught as a little kid in church that the Exodus Pharaoh died in in the water debacle, where you have the army of Egypt that's engulfed by the waters of the what's literally the Sea of Reeds. We call it the Red Sea, and it killed his army. And we are taught that the Pharaoh died with them. But once I studied history and I was able to confidently identify the Exodus Pharaoh, who's Amenhotep II, and I studied his biography, and I matched up the chronology of Egypt with the chronology of the Israelites and synchronized them carefully together, I realized that he actually outlived the events that happened when his army died. And I scratched my head and I said, that doesn't make any sense, because I was always taught that he died with his army in the sea. So what did I do? Well, I had studied all levels of Hebrew, so I studied the passages in Exodus and Psalms that deal with this. And in Hebrew, it never actually says that the Pharaoh himself died with his army. And all of a sudden, light bulbs came on, and I said, wow, my Sunday school understanding was wrong. And because I was willing to put it on trial, then I was able to allow enough evidence to persuade me of a different view. And so my encouragement to all of us is that we take our views and we essentially, as it were, we put them on the altar and we subject them to fire. Let fire come down, let it heat it up, and all the wood, hay, and stubble will burn away. And if what is your view is correct, then every part of it that remains, right? It's like silver and gold. It remains, and it's pure, and it's strong, and it's defensible because you've subjected it to fire. So that's the approach that we need to have, or else we can be in really big trouble.
Hey, thank you for that, Dr. Petrovich. And I wanted to add one note to that, because I talk a lot about church history and stuff on my channel, and I could see when you were saying, well, we can't go to the medieval authorities on this, that's probably some of my viewers are jumping out of their seats, being like, oh, he's rejecting tradition. I want to say that's not the case. You and I talked on the phone for an hour a few days ago. We were talking somewhat about church history and tradition. And I think what you're saying here, correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, is that on especially these chronological issues, it's not like the church fathers or the medievals knew very much about the history of ancient Egypt and Assyria, and that's not their fault. Most of this stuff was not rediscovered until the modern world, so how could they? If you look at their own writings, they want to know the chronology of this time period. Like, I'm sure if Jerome had the records we have now, he would have loved it. Like, he puts in every chronological detail he can in his commentaries. He just doesn't have the resources we now have. Right. But I think you're very right there, the importance of taking into account all these resources we have for when we're working, especially on these chronological issues or these details that really relate to the ancient world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you raised a good point, and I definitely don't want to communicate that I don't see value in earlier or in, let's call them later sources, church history, church fathers. I do. I have a great respect for them. And it's all part of the equation when we add the evidence together. And I'm not suggesting that we ignore later sources and just embrace earlier ones. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that we look at every one of the sources and see what they all have to say, right? And then start to weigh out the value of the evidence that's there. That's the point. And that we approach issues in a way that we're willing to part with maybe a traditional understanding if and only if the evidence just kind of rises up and screams out at us and says, there's a better way. That's the point.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we can get into maybe, first of all, I wanted to ask a little bit more about your background, because when I first started talking to you, you described yourself as an interdisciplinarian. So what are your fields of study, and how is this your use of multiple disciplines very helpful to your study?
Sure. And I've found that interdisciplinarianism is the way to go. The more fields that you can become competent in, and it's not necessarily the case that you're going to become an expert in every single field you study. I mean, the broader that you go, the more, the thinner it becomes. You're only able to do so much. But having said that, it's really important that we study various disciplines and allow those various disciplines to help us in the acquisition of evidence that we can then marshal together to kind of come up with, right views on issues. But the areas of my greatest expertise, I think, in my study include, first of all, biblical studies, and especially biblical languages. I more or less, in my 2 master's degrees from a Christian seminary, I focused mostly, not exclusively, but mostly on the biblical languages. So I took 9 semesters of Greek, 7 semesters of Hebrew, 2 semesters of Aramaic. There are small parts in the Hebrew Bible that are actually Aramaic. And then I went on to study them further, write journal articles that delve into the language, biblical languages. And then I ended up teaching, and I've taught every level of Hebrew and every level of Greek. So, and that all encompasses the discipline I would call exegesis. So the exegesis of the original languages of the Bible in the original languages. That's one of my specializations. And the other, and I kind of, and when I was teaching in Russia, I taught in Russia for 10 years. And there it came upon me that I just really need to be able to offer my students more than what I have. So I decided I'll go and do a PhD somewhere. And I decided I'm not going to do it in the exact same discipline I was already taught. In other words, I could do a PhD in exegesis, and it'll be easier for me. And, it's just, writing a dissertation and whatnot, and taking courses and just doing the same thing I've been doing. But I thought, no, I want to do something that's going to complement my training in the study of the original languages of the Bible. So what God, I believe, led me to was the area of biblical history, which I love, because since I was a junior higher and I went to a secular junior high, I had a teacher there, a German man, and he loved history. He loved geology. And I walked away from the 7th and 8th grade classes I took with him with a love for history and a love for geology, because he just imparted that in me. He loved it so much. I just kind of naturally, sucked it from him and took that on. And so God gave me the opportunity to study in the area of ancient history. So I did my PhD at the University of Toronto, studying or focusing my major on the archaeology of the Holy Land, but then doing a first minor in Egyptian. So I had 3 years of Egyptian language. That's hieroglyphics, Middle and Late Egyptian hieroglyphics. And then ancient Near Eastern history was my second minor. So those are the areas of my discipline. And what I found is that the effort that it took, and it took a lot more effort to do, and I did my 3rd master's. I did an MA to prove myself to the faculty at the University of Toronto, and then after that did my PhD. But all of that, I've now seen how God has been able to stretch me and allow me to study issues and try to solve issues that I couldn't otherwise do if I hadn't had such interdisciplinary training.
I think what you said about interdisciplinary research is really important in creationism as well. It's such a small community that a lot of the time creationists tend to be loners, whereas in the larger community, there can often be a tendency towards more disciplines working together. But here it's especially so important with the Bible and such, specific textual details that we have to incorporate into our models, where geologists and biologists can come up with these theories that can be invalidated just by the text of the Bible alone. And so that's why it's such a specific and necessary part of creation science, especially.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
And that's sort of why I wanted to organize this discussion in the first place, because, there's been a lot of good work on creation flood geology and really laying down when the different layers of rock were laid down by the flood. There's been a lot of good work done in biology and baraminology and developing models of how animals diversified after the flood. And I encountered the work of Peter and his teacher Todd Wood through this, whereas they're trying to apply these models of baraminology to humans and explaining early human skeletons. And then I encountered your work, Dr. Petrovich, in doing archaeology, But I felt, we have we're sort of working from different ends. One end sort of starting around the time of Abraham and working backwards. And then the other one starting with the flood and working forwards. So we need to work better to meet in the middle. And it seems like Babel is this event where the two disciplines meet in the middle. And so that's why I was so excited to do this. So I reached out to you initially about just discussing Babel. And you mentioned you're doing all this other research in the pre-Abrahamic period. And I thought, well, we should really bring in all the evidence, not just Babel, in this discussion. And so you first wanted to bring up, you mentioned you've been researching the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6. And this is such a fascinating passage because, there's probably more opinions on what this passage means than there are words in the passage. And this goes back to very early times. You can go to the earliest church fathers on it, and already some of them think this has to do with giants and fallen angels, and some of them thinks this has to do with the lines of Cain and Seth. Many Christians believe that there were giants on the earth, especially in the time before the flood. And this has especially been repopularized nowadays by the work of Michael Heiser, and we can get into maybe some of his thoughts on it as well. But do you, as an archaeologist and a biblical exegete, bringing these two disciplines together, believe there were giants on the earth, and what makes you convinced of that view?
Sure. Great question. And I guess I'll start off by saying, first of all, I don't really have a dog in the race, so I'm open to whatever is right. And to where the evidence leads. But I can tell you from my view where I think the evidence is pointing to, at least as I see it now. And who knows, 5 or 10 years from now, I may change. But, you asked about as an archaeologist who's studied the ancient Near East. And by the way, in my PhD program, guess what I was encouraged to do by my advisor? To expand my horizons, to become more interdisciplinary within the whole discipline of archaeology. So even though we focused on what's called the Northern Levant, which is ancient Phoenicia and Syria, mostly, he encouraged me to take other courses. So I studied Egyptian archaeology. I studied Nubian archaeology. Nubia is immediately to the south of Egypt, and Nubia interacts with Egypt throughout antiquity. I studied Mesopotamian history, a year of that. I studied archaeology, and the archaeology of what we call, it's modern Turkey. It's called ancient Asia Minor. It's also called Anatolia in greater antiquity, as well as parts of Southern Europe. So I was pushed to do a lot of study in these areas. And when I look at all of the study of the archaeology of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world, I see absolutely zero evidence for what we would commonly term, I think, the word giants. And who knows if we're even all on the same page. How do you define a giant? How tall is the person? But I see no evidence whatsoever for that. And that takes me back to the Bible to say, if I don't see as an archaeologist any evidence of giants, this idea that many Christians have that there were giants, is it sustainable in the Bible? Okay. And here's one example where I think we can look, and there are various examples we could look at, but there's the issue of the height of Goliath, right? Now, there's a source that you may know of called the MT, or the Masoretic text. That's the Hebrew Bible as we know it, as it's been preserved. And it mainly is preserved in the form of a virtually full manuscript of the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, that dates to about 1000 AD. It's called the Leningrad Codex, which means, of course, that it was housed in Leningrad in Russia. And that codex is important because it gives us the Hebrew text from 1000 BC that's based on, of course, a much earlier text. But it doesn't guarantee that it's going to be correct, that the Masoretic text is going to be correct in every area where there's what we call a textual variant, which means if you compare the Leningrad Codex with some other ancient witness, do they agree? And if they disagree in a certain area, which one is right? Because they probably can't both be right. It had to be written one way or the other. So if you look at the Masoretic text, it says that the height of Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. And the equivalent of that is 9 feet, 9 inches. Or if you're from somewhere outside of the United States, metric system is, what you know better. It's 2.97 meters. All right. Now, if you look at it, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which again date to about the 1st century BC, most of them are 1st century BC. It can be a little bit later, it can be a little bit earlier, but roughly in that era. There's a Dead Sea Scroll, and there are many manuscripts of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, of the 4th century AD. And then there's Josephus, and all of those witnesses preserve a different reading, and that reading is 4 cubits in a span. So not 6 cubits in a span, but 4 cubits in a span. What does that mean? What does that translate to in our terms of height? Well, that would be 6 feet 9 inches in our system, our U.S. system, or in metrics, 2.06 meters. So think about that. That's a major difference. Masoretic text, 9 feet 9 inches. The other witnesses, 6 feet 9 inches. Now, 6 feet 9 inches. If you go to an NBA stadium, and your floor level, and you look around and you see, Kevin Durant, and you see Giannis, what's his name, the Greek guy who's like 7 feet tall or whatever. You walk around them and you look at them, and then you look at your friend next to you and say, wow, those guys are giants, right? Now, they're not really giants. They've grown a lot. They're 6 feet something or 7 feet something, but they're not giants. They're just really tall. So if the Dead Sea Scroll and the Septuagint manuscripts and Josephus are correct, then Goliath was only 6 feet 9 inches tall, which makes him extremely tall, no doubt about it, but technically not a giant. So that's one of the pieces of evidence, I think, that we need to look at and say, maybe in that case, the Masoretic text is preserving the wrong reading, and he was only 6 feet 9 inches tall. So that's some of the evidence that's out there, and there's other we could get into, but yeah. So and one of the other ones that we can get into is actually Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. And in Genesis 6:4, especially if you read the King James Bible, you will see that the word giants actually shows up there. So in chapter 6, verse 4, it's the Hebrew word Nephilim that's there, but giants shows up in the King James Bible. Where does that come from, and is it correct? Does it say actually that they were giants? Is that a correct translation? Well, the reading goes back to the Septuagint. So the Hebrew word Nephilim, and we'll get into that in a minute, is translated by the Septuagint scholars, the Greek scholars, in, again, roughly 275 BC. They translate it gigantes in Greek, gigantes. And then that word is transliterated into the Latin Vulgate as gigantes. And that word was essentially translated into English by the King James Translation Committee as giants. So massively large individuals essentially is what it's getting at. That's the meaning of the term in all three, in Greek and in Latin and in English. But the original word is Nephilim. What does Nephilim mean? It's actually a masculine plural participle in Hebrew that's based on a verb. That's the verb nephal. Nephal technically means he fell. That's the dictionary form. In our language, it would be to fall. That's the dictionary form. But he fell. So the word actually means, and it's used substantively here, not adverbially. So it takes the form of a noun, if you will, masculine plural, and it's those who have fallen. Oh, it's those who have fallen. Well, how do we get giant people out of those who have fallen? Because those who have fallen doesn't say anything about the height of the people. It says something about the change in their position from an elevated one to one where they've descended somewhere. That's what it's getting at. So there was, in my book, there was a major mistake made by the translators of the Septuagint. Why did they choose the word giants? We don't know for sure. I think there's a reason for it, and that's because this word Nephilim, fallen ones, appears also in Numbers 13:33. I actually have that up on my screen here. I'm going to look at it, and it says they're all they're also, and I'm just going to read from the New American Standard rather than my translation, but they're also, we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So what's going on here? Well, there's the use of this word Nephilim that all the Hebrews would know. Yeah, that's the word that comes from Genesis chapter 6. And what's happening? What's the context? Well, these 12 spies that Joshua sends into the promised land, they go into the promised land to look and kind of get the lay of the land and see if we can do this, if we can pull this off and what it's like. And they come back with their report. And of course, it's a mixed report. You have the 10 who say one thing, and then Joshua and Caleb say something completely different. But the 10 are deathly afraid. Why? Because they look at the people. It's kind of like going to that NBA game, right? And you see the tall basketball players, and what do you say? Wow, those guys are giants. Now, technically, these 10 spies don't say we've just seen giants. They say that we became like grasshoppers in their sight. Well, guess what? If you go to that NBA game and you're standing around a bunch of guys who are 6'9" to 7'4" or whatever, then you're going to say we're like grasshoppers next to these people. So they weren't actually calling them giants. They were just saying, comparatively, when we look at ourselves in relation to them, we are really small. So that, I think, is the reason why you have this. In 275 BC, you have the Septuagint, and they're probably Jewish scholars who know Greek, the Greek language inside and out, and they're translating their text into Greek. Probably they're influenced by these two passages that use the same Hebrew word, right? They use the same Hebrew word. And we look at the second one, the Numbers passage, and it looks like these guys are giants next to them. So probably that influenced them to, in my mind, to alter, if not use the term corrupt the original reading and change it from those who have fallen to those who are giant. So then you could ask the question, well, if this is all true, then Dr. P, why do they use the word Nephilim in Numbers 13:33? Well, here's the thing. Nobody says that the understanding and the mindset and the pre-conclusions of these 10 Israelite spies is rooted in that which is, guided by inspiration and the and inerrancy, the protection from error. So I believe that as Moses wrote the original 5 books as we know it of the Bible, he wrote those under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, so that it was a joint work of the Spirit of God and this man Moses, and it became error-free, right? So I don't think we can ascribe the same characteristic to the 10 spies here. They weren't writing something under inspiration of the Spirit of God. They were taking their understanding and essentially codifying it, right? So that in their minds, when they look back to before the flood, to the time of the sons of God and the Nephilim, the fallen ones, they see the fallen ones as gigantic people, right? And it's kind of like the story of when your grandfather went out fishing, right? He caught a fish that was this big. And by the time your dad's day came along, the fish became this big. And by your day, the fish is this big, right? So over time, the story gets better and better and better. And I think that these 10 spies were reading back into the text their preconceived ideas about giantism before the flood. But here's the thing. The Hebrew text of Genesis 6 says nothing whatsoever about the giant size of those people. It says a lot about who they are, but it doesn't tell us about the size that they were. So all that to say, that's enough evidence for me, both as an archaeologist and as a biblical exegete, to say the evidence shows me that there is no such thing as giants. Doesn't mean you can't believe that. You can believe whatever you want. Doesn't mean I'm right. But I'm persuaded that the evidence clearly points us to essentially disengaging from that perspective that says they were giants in the Bible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I also was just thinking, as you were talking about this, that when we hear the word giant, think someone who's maybe like 10, 20, 30 feet tall. But who are we to say that in their minds, a giant had to be that tall? For them, a giant might have been someone who was 7 feet tall. I mean, we use that, as you were pointing out, we use that sort of language even today, where we might say, oh, that person is giant. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
And skeptics, of course, like to talk about the square cube law and all of that. But what's interesting is based off of either, the Masoretic text or the others, all of them fall within what is hypothetically possible for a human being
right?
to actually be based on the square cube law. And so there's nothing in the Bible that actually contradicts physics, as some people want to claim.
Right. And you make a valid point. Even if 9 feet 6 inches is correct, it's technically not something that's beyond reasonable. It's not like 47 feet and 7 inches, right?
I think it does raise some interesting questions, though, about like the power and strength of Goliath and people like that, right? Because at that height, you're not going to be as strong. So then if that were actually the case, it would raise some questions about whether he's simply a figurehead or whether he is actually a very strong individual. But that's a
sure.
question.
And there's much more in the context there that needs to be studied. His spear and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that. So now we have this background. You think, at very least, we're not committed to them being giants or some sort of fallen ones. What are the Nephilim? And also in this context, then, what are the sons of God and the daughters of men? Because it's interesting, I think, that a lot of the debate really stems around not so much the meaning of Nephilim, but the meaning of sons of God and daughters of men.
Sure. So let's go back to Genesis 6. So if you're following along with us, you may want to open your Bible to Genesis 6. And here I'm going to be working with my own translation with any of the texts that I look at. Here's what we read. And I'll just read the first 4 verses because this is really important to kind of get a good feel for all of this, the whole context. And I'll start off by saying it's really important in all of this to note that, and you probably won't see this in your English Bibles, there are places in your English Bibles where you will see there are parentheses. And the parentheses oftentimes, not always, oftentimes are put there to signal to the reader, right? And this is a choice, an interpretive choice by the English Translation Committee that makes that translation. They put the parentheses there to mark off a section as parenthetical. So what does that mean? Let's put it in terms of drama. If we're on the stage, right, and we're performing Hamlet or whatever it is, or Macbeth or something, and I'm one of the actors, and I'm on the stage, and you're on the stage with me, and we're interacting, or we're talking, or we're fighting, or we're arguing, or whatever. There could be a time where all of a sudden the action would stop, and I would turn to the audience, and I would give what's called a soliloquy, right? And in that soliloquy, usually I would give the audience more information that they need so that they can understand a little bit better about what just happened and about what's just going to happen. So it's an aside, if you will. That's what a parenthetical statement is. It's an aside. It's this soliloquy that you give in the middle of the play. Just you stop everything and you add extra information. So all that to say, verse 4 here is not part of the narrative flow of events. Verse 4 is a parenthetical thought. It's an aside. It's a soliloquy. That's what verse 4 is. So in my translation, I put around the entire verse, I put parentheses because it is a parenthetical thought. All right, so here we go. And this is, I'm going to give you an interpretive translation. So I'm adding elements interpretively along as a result of having translated it from Hebrew, that I want to bring some things out for you in English. So here's Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Now it came to pass that the man, that is the race of mankind, that's what it means there. Okay. And I did a 5-part series on this, a video series on the sons of God. You can find this online and you can look at all that. I think it's on, when I taught at the Bible seminary, I did it there, and I think it's on their webpage. So I go into all the details to demonstrate why that this is the race of mankind. What does that mean? The term the man here, it goes back, it's the Hebrew word Adam, and it goes back to the first man. The first man was called Adam. And then later, as you move into the early chapters of Genesis, you go from chapters 1 and 2, and then you move on to 3, 4, and 5. All of a sudden, you have this transition where Adam is not just used for Adam, but it's used for all those who descended from him, right? So now it came to pass that the man, that doesn't mean Adam. It doesn't mean Adam began to increase on the surface of the earth and daughters were born to them, plural. No, it doesn't fit with the grammar. This isn't Adam. So what is the man? The man is the race of mankind, Ha-Adam, the man, the race of mankind that finds its root in Adam, right? So anyone born of Adam fits into this category of the man here. So that's what we have, the race of mankind. Now it came to pass that the race of mankind began to increase on the surface of the earth, and daughters were born to them. So the race of Adam increases on the earth, and daughters were born to the descendants of Adam, right? Verse 2, then the sons of God saw the daughters of the man, that is the race of mankind. They looked at them and they noticed that they were beautiful. So they took women for themselves. From whom? Remember, from whom? From the race of mankind, who have descended from Adam. So there's a clear contrast and go back to verse 1. There's a clear contrast between those who descend from Adam, right? Because at the beginning, it's universal gender. They began to increase on the surface of the earth. Not just women, but men. Men and women descended from Adam began to increase on the surface of the earth, and daughters were born to them. So among those descendants, we're going to focus now on some of the females, the daughters, the female descendants of Adam. They were beautiful. So these sons of God, whoever they are, they took women for themselves from all whom they had chosen. Now, by the way, it doesn't say anywhere that they married them. The word marriage is not here. It just says that they took them. They took women. They grabbed them. That's the implication. So this is, let's just be honest here, this is statutory rape. That's what's going on. So he who is, that's the covenant name of God. And Gideon, you remember we talked about that the other night. He who is the one who goes on existing. So he who is said, he looked at this and he made his judgment and he said, my spirit will not contend with the man. What do we know from the context? That's the race of mankind, not just Adam. My spirit will not contend with the race of mankind forever, of whom he is flesh. So God is distancing himself in a sense from mankind, looking at himself and saying, I am spirit. And he doesn't say it here, but the implication is, I am holy and I'm not engaged in this kind of sin. But mankind is engaged in all of this. And the sons of God, whoever they are. Thus, his days will be 120 years. So that's temporarily the end of the narrative, the end of the events, whether they're predictive or whatever. It's the end of the events. And now in verse 6, we're going to get into this parenthetical thought. But what is this implication? His days will be 120 years. This doesn't mean, okay, that 120 years from now, I'm going to bring about the flood. No, that's insignificant. The flood is a temporary event. The issue is what, God speaking, if you will, what am I going to do with mankind who's not like I am, who's evil in all his thoughts? What am I going to do with him? Because all of his thoughts are evil continually, right? So whatever God does, it has to be a judgment, a futuristic judgment that's looking forward to a time when he's going to limit the debauchery that's going on the earth, right? That's what he's going to do. So what he's getting at here is, this is a prediction, this is a prophecy that the lifespan of mankind will not exceed 120 years. Guess what happens after the flood? After the flood, you look at the table of nations. You look at the Genesis 6 account. You look at the other genealogy. You see the lifespan of mankind going down and down and down and down, and then it bottoms off. There's Moses and I think one other guy, not to, of his generation or so, who live 120 years. And according to the Bible, nobody else ever lives 120 years after that. Nobody. Before that, they did. After this, they don't. So I believe that's God's judgment manifesting itself, not immediately. I mean, God didn't, he could have, but he didn't click his fingers and say 120 years lifespan starts today. But he could have done it in such a way that he implemented over time, and that mankind's lifespan dwindled all the way down until it maxed out at 120 years around the lifetime of Moses. And there's a lot that can be said about that, and I can say about it as an archaeologist, especially looking at radiocarbon evidence. By the way, there's a lot that can be said there, but we'll skip that. Now let's get into the text. This is verse 4. Oh, before we do, let's try to answer this question. Who are the sons of God? Because they're the original perpetrators in all of this. Who are the sons of God? The word there is, in Hebrew, it's B'nai Ha-Elohim, sons of the God, literally, sons of the God. Now, B'nai Ha-Elohim is what we call a technical term in Hebrew. It's a technical term. And that technical term shows up in a few places. One of the most profound places it shows up is the beginning of Job. Job 1 and Job 2, you have that same technical term, B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God. And what happens there, what we see is that these individuals called the sons of God, they pair up together with Satan, and they elevate themselves, or they take themselves into the presence of God, right? How they can do this, we don't know. They do it. They go into the presence of God. And of course, the intention is for Satan to persuade God that Job is not really a faithful man of his. And so Satan wants to bring about torture and afflictions to Job that would cause him to turn away from God. That's the whole point in all of this. So Satan goes to the presence of God with evil intentions, to be sure. And the sons of God join him. So that being the case, who are the sons of God? Well, you can't have mankind coming and going from the throne of God, can you? There's no way that any human being can be in view in Job 1 or in Job 2. It's got to be angelic beings. These are angelic beings who join themselves with Satan and go to God's presence, and together want to devise this evil plan against Job to turn him against God. So clearly, these are angelic beings. This technical term is used as such. There's also a passage in, Job 38, I believe, that says that the sons of God were there at the creation, watching all of these things take place, right? And they were rejoicing, watching them take place during creation. So probably sons of God, as a technical term, more holistically is looking at the entire body, if you will, of angelic beings, good and evil together. But then over time, of course, you have the fall of Satan, and you have the separation, if you will, of the good angels and the evil angels. And the evil angels, of course, are the ones you see in Job 1 and 2. Good angels are the ones like, Michael and Gabriel and so forth in the book of Daniel, and appearing in at the birth of Jesus and so forth, and doing various things over time. So you have these good angels, evil angels, but the ones in view in Job 1 and 2 are strictly evil angels. They've gone into the presence with Satan with evil intentions. So that being the case, that technical term, how are we supposed to understand it? Almost certain in Genesis 6, almost certainly it's that same idea. These are evil angelic beings. And that makes sense because in the context, remember, they're contrasted with the race of mankind. Whoever the sons of God are, they're not human beings. That's the point. So Michael Heiser is right about this. And is this an attractive view? No, it's a very unattractive view. Do I like the idea that evil angelic beings were given human flesh and were given all of the faculties of the human body, that they could even commit intimate relations with females who descended from the line of who were in the line of Adam and descended from him? Do I like that concept? No. Do I wish it weren't true? Maybe so, if I had my choice. But here's the bottom line. My choice doesn't matter. What matters is the will of God. And God determined that there would be evil angelic beings who were undoubtedly, and this is in the background, we don't see it in the text, given permission by God to take on human flesh and procreate with the daughters of mankind. Now you say, well, how can evil angelic beings do this? This is like, going to the umpteenth degree what a human can do. Okay, I've got news for you. God shows up, right, to Abram, and what does he do? He takes on human flesh, with angels there, and he eats together with Abram. So here you have a spirit being, right? And God has said this. There are places other places in the Bible where it says, that God is spirit, right? And we must worship him in spirit and in truth, etc. So if God is spirit, how can he manifest himself into the form of human flesh and eat food? He shouldn't be able to do that. Well, guess what? Jesus Christ is a perfect example of God manifesting himself as human flesh, and he could do all the things that a man could do. So if Jesus can do it, if God can do it in Abram's day, and then return to spirit form after that, why can't God give permission to evil angelic beings to take on human flesh to be able to do this? He can, and in this case, I'm convinced he did, whether we like it or not.
Can you comment a little bit on kind of Jesus discussion? So later on, I don't remember the specific context in the gospel. Jesus talks about how when we go to heaven, we'll be like the angels in heaven who neither marry nor give in marriage. Can you kind of comment on that and maybe some of the implications you think it might have?
And I think there he's talking about good angels alone, right?
Okay.
Because they're the ones who are in the presence of God continually, and the ones who are faithful to him and will remain faithful to him and won't go to that place of utter torment and suffering known as the lake of fire, also known as hell, eternally, where they'll pay for their crimes. So when Jesus gives that statement, I think he's referring to good angels who are following the will of God, who are manifesting their own place of where they should be. In fact, let me read a passage in 1 Peter that relates to this, because this is a New Testament version of what's happening. Here's the question. What then happens to these evil angelic beings who take on human flesh? One of the answers is found in 1 Peter chapter 3. So from verse 17, it says this: "For it is better to go on suffering while practicing good, if the will of God should wish, than while practicing evil. Because Christ indeed died once concerning sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, so that he may bring you to God, on the one hand being put to death in the flesh, but on the other hand being brought to life," and here's the term, en pneumati in Greek, in spirit, brought to life in spirit. So there's a contrast between the flesh and the spirit. Put to death in the flesh, but in spirit, brought to life. And then Peter goes into a little greater detail about what's this place, what's going on in this realm of the spirit, the spiritual realm. And he says this, verse 19, "In which also," meaning in the realm of the spirit, "in which also he gave a proclamation," he being Jesus, right? Because he's the one who procured this, putting to death our sin nature in us. So he purchased a place for us in God's eternal family. It's Jesus behind it. "In which also he," implication Jesus, "gave a proclamation." This is from the verb kerusso. The verb kerusso is not the verb evangelizo, which means to preach the gospel, to preach the good news for salvation, but to proclaim, to announce something. This is the term that's used of what a town crier does. He stands up in front of the whole town, at the town square, and he makes an announcement for the mayor or for the whatever, and he announces what's going to happen. So that's what Jesus did. He made a proclamation after going to the spirits in prison. The spirits in prison. Who are these spirits in prison you're talking about, Peter? Verse 20. After their disobedience in a previous time. So spirits disobeyed in an earlier time. What was the time? When the long suffering of God was in the state of waiting during the days of Noah, while an ark was being prepared, right? So in the days of Noah, spirit beings were disobedient. How were they disobedient? They took on human flesh. They went after daughters of mankind, and they had physical relations with them, and they bore to them. So offspring came, and all of this was polluting the earth. And to finish your question, Peter, so in the eternal state, there will be no marriage or giving in marriage, which suggests to us there will be no physical relations between males and females. It won't happen. There won't be birthing. There won't be pregnancy and birthing. It won't be needed because there's something better waiting for us there. I'm convinced. So anyway, that passage in 1 Peter is one of the important ones that focuses on what's happening afterward. Another one is Ephesians 4, verses 8 through 10, where it says this. Therefore it says, having ascended on high, he, and that's Jesus, led captivity captive. He gave gifts to humans. So he did this. He ascended to where the Father was, and he gave gifts to humans from there. And then verse 9, it says, now the saying, he ascended, went up into the presence of God. What is its meaning except that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth? So when Jesus descended into the lower parts of the earth, that is where he made that proclamation to the spirits who were in prison. So Jesus is on the cross at Calvary. He physically dies. His spirit departs from his body. Where does the spirit go? It goes down into the caverns of the earth, and it goes to this place where there is a prison. And in that prison, there are spirit beings from the days of Noah who committed horrendous acts of disobedience. Those are the ones from Genesis chapter 6. So Jesus goes down there. He descends down there into the lower parts of the earth to make this announcement, this proclamation to them. And then Jude 6, and this is what I was alluding to. Jude 6 reads, and angels who did not maintain their own domain. So the domain of angels is the spiritual realm. That's where they're supposed to hang out. They're not supposed to be engaging in activities in the fleshly realm with us. They're not supposed to take on human flesh and do things. That's not normal. That's not good. That's not righteous. That's not the ultimate best. So Jude 6, and angels who did not maintain their own domain, but abandoned their proper place of habitation, he, that is God, has guarded in perpetual bonds under darkness. Wow. God took them and bound them and basically put shackles on them in perpetual bonds under darkness. Where is that darkness? It's down in the center of the earth, wherever that is. So it's not all the way to the magma necessarily, but down into the caverns of the earth, the place where Jesus went to make the proclamation. What did Jesus proclaim? This is important. What did he announce? The Bible never tells us, okay? So essentially I'm stepping off from the level of an exegete, and I'm now you're putting on the hat of a theologian. And I'm going to tell you what Jesus announced, I'm convinced, and I'm not alone in this, is that the plan that Satan had to corrupt the purely human line that was supposed to go from Adam to Jesus, right? There was supposed to be a pure human line all the way from Adam to Jesus so that he could take on the sins of the world and so that all of mankind could be renewed through him. if Satan knew that if he could break that purely human line, that it would corrupt God's intent to bring about a universal salvation for all of mankind, right? So that being the case, Jesus announced to those spirit beings who were in prison there, who in the days of Noah tried to corrupt that pure human line that would go from Adam to Jesus. And he announced to them their plan failed categorically. He was able to be born with a purely human line going all the way from Adam, unscathed, all the way to the time of Mary and Joseph, and to be born to the Virgin. And therefore, his sacrificial death became applicable, able to be applied universally to all mankind. So that is what Jesus announced. So that's what's going on in Genesis chapter 6. An attempt to corrupt the purely human line that had to go from Adam to Jesus.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. And yes, we're going on now. I'd love to, go all day on Genesis 6, but I'd like to also eventually get over to Babel.
Sure.
Maybe we'll have to do a second stream at some point, going more in depth on the sons of God. But as you're going into verse 4, when you mentioned it, that verse 4 was parenthetical, and I took a look at it again as you were reading the earlier verses. I'm pretty sure I know what you're about to say, which is that the Nephilim are not the ones born to the sons of God, the daughters of men, but are a reference back to these fallen angels. Is that right?
Exactly. You're on my trail. So right or wrong, here's what I'm convinced is true. Verse 4, here's what it says. The fallen ones were on the earth in those days. So I'm translating directly. And listen, I always tell my language students, whenever humanly possible, don't transliterate, translate. Remove all doubt. Translate. What's the purpose of an English translation if you're giving us Hebrew or Greek words? It doesn't help us. The word baptize, that's not an English word. That's a Greek word. What does it mean? It means to immerse, to take something and put it fully under, so there's a surface of a liquid, to take something and bring it so it's fully under the surface of a liquid and it's fully submerged within that liquid. That's what it means. So here, the meaning is the fallen ones, and that's what they are. The fallen ones were on the earth in those days, and afterwards also, when the sons of God were going into the daughters of the man and sired offspring to them. They, that is the sons of God, the fallen ones, were the powerful ones, the Giborim. Now, mighty men, bad translation. Better translation, powerful ones. That's the issue here. That's what a Giborim is, a Gibor, who were from antiquity. And it doesn't say male, it doesn't say men here, folks. It says males of renown. If it said men, they would have to be from the line of Adam. But it doesn't say they were men. It says they were males. Once it says that they're males, now they don't have to be from the line of Adam. So my whole point is that the sons of God in verse 2, who are mentioned again in verse 6:4, are equivalent with the fallen ones and the powerful ones. It's like, we have a coin on, we have a quarter. On one side is George Washington. What's on the other side? Monticello or something like that. I forget. So it's the same coin as one coin. Either way, it's worth 25 cents. But it has two completely different images on it. Yet they're both part of the same coin. So the sons of God are equal to the fallen ones. Who are the fallen ones, and why are they called the fallen ones? Well, there's a verse, and I think in Luke, I can't remember now exactly where it is, where it says, where Jesus is speaking, and it says, he watched Satan fall from heaven like lightning, right? Jesus watched Satan fall from heaven like lightning. If Satan fell, and Satan took with him a part of the angelic host, and they became his evil followers, then wouldn't they have fallen too? So almost certainly the reference here to fallen ones is looking at that. That's the side of the coin that we're focusing on. This is the Washington side. They're fallen ones. They are ones who fell from somewhere. From where? From the presence of God in heaven. From the abode of God. They fell because they followed after Satan and his attempt to subvert what God wanted to do. So, and the fact that it says they were the powerful ones, again, that's not mighty men like the mighty men of David. That's the implication there is they were good guys. You know, the mighty men of David. They were his loyal soldiers who did a great job of following the word of the king. No, these are powerful ones. And they were doing powerful deeds. They were physically strong, and they were prevailing upon the women, right? And they're just raping them left and right and bringing about an offspring that's, again, intended to corrupt the line of man.
When you had the word, what was it? Giborim there. I went quickly. I was curious what interlinear of where else it comes up. You mentioned David. And it's interesting. I don't know what to make of this at all. But the next spot it comes up from Genesis 6:4 is in Genesis 10:8-9 with Nimrod being called Giborim. We'll get into Nimrod later in the show. But I just noticed that was the interesting connection.
Yeah, and we can't lose sight of that connection, Gideon. That's really important because that's a perfect example of Gibor used of someone who's not a good guy, but is an extremely evil guy, right? Mm-hmm. So we can't look at Genesis 6:4 and think good guys necessarily. It's essentially a term that could go either way. That's the bottom line. The issue is they were powerful. David's soldiers, powerful. His elite, Nimrod, powerful. They're both powerful, but they're doing different things with their power. That's the point.
Yeah. So yeah, since this show also, our goal was to bring in the archaeological evidence. So this is before the flood, where it seems like we don't really have much evidence or any evidence of humans before the flood. But do you think there is any archaeological connection here?
You know, that's a great question. And this is going to cause Peter's eyes to go like this, I think. So we'll see what he thinks of it. But here's my working hypothesis. And footnote, okay? This is a working hypothesis. It's not a lifetime conviction, okay? It's not that level. I'm not 100% sure. But my working hypothesis is, and I've had it for over 20 years now, and I've not been able to disprove it yet. That's the thing. Maybe the day will come where I can disprove it, but it hasn't come yet. So let's go back in time before the flood. If God did give evil angelic beings the ability to take on human flesh, and they procreated with daughters of mankind and produced an offspring, what would God want to do with that offspring? Probably. He'd probably want to cut it off, right? So the flood is right around the door. But here's the point. They had to have bodies that then, you know, they died too. If no time earlier, they died at the time of the flood. Right, because everyone not in the ark died among human beings, and so their bodies couldn't live any further. So there were clearly deaths taking place of these evil angelic beings who took on human flesh and their offspring. They were all, both groups were dying, or if they lived, they died in the flood. So, as an archaeologist, or let's say you're an anthropologist. As an anthropologist, can you come up with a way of identifying in the archaeological record evidence of the bodies of these sons of God who took on human flesh? Can we identify them? My working hypothesis says maybe we can. Well, who would they be? All right, let's go to and you both are familiar with the work of flood geologists such as Steve Austin and Andrew Snelling.
Yes.
Andrew Snelling is convinced that we can connect the coal beds, right, around the world, especially in North America. We have a prime example of massive coal beds. We can connect the coal beds with the death of the organic material, the plant life that was alive on the earth at the time of the universal flood. Okay? And that's datable with radiocarbon evidence. And the radiocarbon evidence dates it to around, 49,000 BC. Okay, so 49,000 BC is the time, according to radiocarbon evidence, that this took place. Now, there's a whole discussion I could get into with you on radiocarbon evidence. I need 20 minutes or half an hour to walk through all of that, but I won't get into all of that unless you twist my arm. But the point is this. There is a group of individuals, and maybe Peter has studied them, I don't know, called the Neanderthal. They're very, very, very different than your stereotypical hominids. Technically, they're called hominids, but they're very different. Their skeletal structure is different. They have a much more protruded skull. Their bones are much thicker. On the whole, they're shorter than your typical hominids. But boy, are they strong. They are, dare I use the term, powerful ones. They're really strong. So it just so happens that that Neanderthals died off in what's typically termed in time frame of radiocarbon evidence about 40,000 BC. Right about that time where Christian flood geologists would say we have this cutoff where the flood took place. We can see in the geological column where the flood is. Here are the layers below it, and here are the layers after it. And Neanderthal dies off right here, okay? Now, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I forget exactly when, evidence was found of interbreeding between our standard hominids and Neanderthal. Interesting. That's just what we see in Genesis 6, isn't it? We see interbreeding between the sons of God who took on human flesh and the daughters of mankind. Okay, that's all good so far. Then there's something really fascinating. I'm going to grab a book here. Hold on a second. This is a book that just came out in, I think, 2018, 2019, one of those years. It's called Who We Are and How We Got Here, Ancient DNA and the New Science of the Human Past by David Reich. I don't know if you're familiar with David Reich. He's one of the world's leading geneticists, probably the leading geneticist in the United States of America. I think Harvard is where he is, I'm pretty sure. But something happened years ago, and he followed all of this, right? In Europe, I think it's in Germany, they created this, this laboratory that was able to do what's called whole genome research. Peter, are you familiar with that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So basically, you can do a kind of mapping of an individual in ways you could never do before, to do whole genome research, to put it in simple terms, right? Mm-hmm. So there was this lab in Germany that did that. And then David Reich came along, and he said, I want to apply the Henry Ford model to this laboratory idea to be able to study whole genome research. So he comes up with funding, and he creates this massive, laboratory system that is able to do exceedingly more than that one laboratory in Germany was able to do. So with those capabilities, they started doing research, and David Reich has this real fetish for the people of antiquity, which I'm really excited about. And he's not a Christian, by the way, as far as I know. As far as I know, he's extremely secular. But he did a study, among other things, on Neanderthal. He came up with something that blew his mind completely. What he found through whole genome research was he studied all of the people groups on Earth that we can get our hands on who have some element of Neanderthal in them. There are people groups that don't have any, that have pretty much zero. And I think some of those are in Africa. Some of those are in maybe Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. But there are people groups that have zero Neanderthal DNA in them. But what he found was this, that in studying all of the traceable Neanderthal DNA that he could get his hands on, that everyone alive today who has some amount of Neanderthal DNA in him or her, all of that can be traced back to 2 or 3 women. All of that DNA has to filter through. It's kind of like, what did we used to call that back in the day? You guys are too young to know this. In the early days of computers, there was a 64K bottleneck. That's what it was. So your RAM had to go through the 64K bottleneck. It's kind of like an hourglass, right? I had to go through a 64K bottleneck, and then you could use it on your computer, on your RAM. So there's this bottleneck where everyone with this DNA, this Neanderthal DNA, it goes through 2 or 3 women.
Are you talking about?
Believe this?
Are you talking about Neanderthal women or Homo sapiens women that are ancestral that have the Neanderthal introgression?
The standard hominids who today have some element of Neanderthal DNA in them.
Okay.
Among their other DNA. So he couldn't believe that this is true. It makes no sense that there would be this kind of bottleneck. So he cleaned his lab completely, redid all of the tests, same result. Still didn't believe it. Completely cleaned his lab again, tested again, same results. He still couldn't believe it. He contacted the laboratory in Germany, had them clean their lab, sent them the data or the samples that could be checked. They checked it there, and they came up with the exact same conclusion. All of it goes back to 2 or 3 women. Well, where was there a bottleneck in human history? How about Noah's day? How about the 8 people who were alive on the ark? How about that there were 3 sons of Noah and 3 daughters who came from other people? Wow, really? So if 1 or 2 daughters or daughter-in-laws of Noah had Neanderthal DNA, they could then spread that throughout all of the humanity that would come forth from Noah's day until ours. That is the only way that bottleneck makes sense. So, and again, it's around 40,000 BC that Neanderthal dies off. So if the plant life dies off at around 49,000 BC, according to our conventional understanding of radiocarbon decay, then it's plausible that the plant life that originally was, came to life much earlier than the death of the Neanderthal at the flood. So if the Neanderthal dies at the flood, they die at the same time as that plant life that ends up in the coal beds. And it really makes perfect sense chronologically. So all of that conspires to suggest to us that maybe the Neanderthal are the missing link, if you will. These are those who would have died at the time of the flood.
So to be clear, you're going to place a flood boundary basically right around that 40,000 year date for the extinction of the Neanderthals?
Yes, and that is, for 40, yeah, right.
Roughly in that area.
40,000 BC, a little bit earlier, somewhere in there, yeah.
To me, that seems to be a problematic time to place a flood date, because a flood boundary, right? Because even the geologists who you mentioned, like Andrew Snelling and Dr. Steve Austin, they're going to place a flood boundary more at the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary, right? Not so late. The earliest people, the Cretaceous who I could think of who placed the latest flood day is the people over at ICR, like Dr. Tim Clary, and they're going to put it at the Neogene to the Quaternary, which radiometrically dated is like 20 some million years old. So can you kind of tell us a little bit about how you kind of justify placing a flood date so high up, especially when I think geologically speaking, some of kind of the sediments that we see there don't seem to be the type that we would expect to be placed by a flood. And also we have, for example, Neanderthals living in caves or buried in caves that are carved into rock that would have been formed during the flood, which seems kind of problematic in an interpretation like that.
Yeah, but are we sure that rock has been formed in the flood?
Well, if you're going to place that, well, that would depend on your pre-flood boundary, right? I mean, where do you go on that?
Well, again, I'm suggesting that the conventional demise of the Neanderthal is right around that very time of where Andrew Snelling puts the in the geological column, all of those flood events that include the physical remains that are left behind after the flood. So that has to be right around the same time as they're working with.
But even if we ask Dr. Snelling, he holds the Cretaceous Tertiary flood boundary, right? So he thinks that geologically the flood boundary predates the Neanderthals.
He does.
Yes, he does.
I think to maybe communicate is stepping in here as a non-expert in either field. So I'll maybe try and communicate a bit here just as I'm trying to understand both these. I think what Peter's getting at is a distinction between the radiometric dates for them and the stratigraphy, basically looking at the different layers of rock. So I think Peter's concern is regardless of where Neanderthals and coal are carbon dated to, of where they come in the rock layers, and it seems like there's a bunch of rock layers with the flood. Then Neanderthals come on top of that land that was laid by the flood and die there in ways that don't look like they died in a flood. And so that would place them, regardless of that carbon dating and so on, which I think as creationists you'd have to say is sort of the least important evidence, in some ways. That it would be hard to explain the sorts of findings we find. So I think a very interesting recent research, and this is all very recent, so it's very open to discussion, is Homo naledi, which is a group that Peter and Dr. Todd Wood think are humans. Other creationists think are not. I'm not going to settle that issue. But they are dated older than Neanderthals, and they clearly went into a cave to bury their dead within that cave by dropping them down this pit. And we've even now found fire, possibly at least, hasn't been published yet, but the excavators there say they have found evidence of fire usage there as well. So it seems like we find these examples of burials of either humans or things that at least look like humans that are clearly from after the flood that are before Neanderthals even. And so that's sort of my thought process on it as a non-expert in either field. It seems like this is the sort of creature that would have settled there after the flood,
Now, naledi actually does occur simultaneously with Neanderthals.
Okay.
Yeah. But if we go back to naledi is interesting because the cave systems where naledi is found, I believe they're Precambrian in origin, the actual rock which they're carved into. But going back to kind of the flood boundary, I don't think we as creationists can be very definitive on the flood boundary, right? There's certain creationists who want to go for a very early flood boundary within like the Triassic layers, which most creationists are going to say is right in the middle of the flood. But what we have there is it has conventionally been recognized as a mass extinction because a lot of species that we see disappear from the flood sediments there, if that's what they are, and then new species appear. And a lot of geologists typically would think of that as a mass extinction. And so some creationists say that is the flood boundary. Other creationists want to say the Cretaceous Tertiary, which is more typical, where the dinosaurs most famously die out there. And then others want to place it yet further. But I think that the types of rock layers are really informative for this. So when we get to very late layers, geologically speaking, we tend to see a more localized depositional environment. They're not such broad, widespread layers, which seems to indicate a trend from a global scale of deposition down to a more localized area. And so that's really my concern here, right? That these sediments that we are finding Neanderthals in and other hominins in as well are very localized sediments. And so that would seem to indicate that they're coming after the flood and not before it. But and I think previously I kind of mentioned the caves. I think an interesting area of research would be to look at stone tools as well, because I know for at least some of the instances we can identify the rock that tools are actually made of and go find where that is. And in some cases, at least, we know that Neanderthals were using rocks that were made in the flood. I'd have to go look into that as well. But I think the caves and the stone tools are both examples of that might help us resolve an issue like this.
Sure. And I've been wanting to sit down and talk to Andrew Snelling more about it and kind of walk through all of the issues with the geological column and the possibilities. So I haven't done that yet. But, it's worth considering. And I guess for my part, I would want to make sure that we're kind of turning over every stone to make sure that we're not misunderstanding something here.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And that's why I think it's best to be open to all of the different flood boundaries right now. I mean, I don't think we can be too definitive. I think the Cretaceous Tertiary flood boundary is probably the best one that we have as of now, because the very late flood boundaries, like the one you're mentioning and the one which ICR supports, they have problems with faunal succession. There was a paper published recently in the Answers Research Journal where the researcher looked at where exactly certain taxa of animals would appear. And on either side of this boundary, they appear in the same place. Well, that's not what we would expect if a flood came through and wiped animals out, that the kinds migrate all the way from wherever the ark lands back to the place where they lived before the flood, right? That'd be a rather unusual conclusion to reach. And so that's why I think one of these mass extinction events probably fits better with where we would think of the flood boundary in terms of faunal succession.
Sure.
What do you kind of think about Denisovan DNA, right? You talked about how you thought Neanderthals' DNA basically came from this introgression from angelic beings. What do you do with Denisovans?
And tell me, who are they?
Oh, okay. So Denisovans were discovered in Denisova cave way out in like Siberia, and they basically seem to have been a separate group that was distinct from the Neanderthals. And so we've been able to sequence their DNA as well. And it appears in Southeast Asians and Australians in even higher percentages than Neanderthal DNA in some cases. But we've also been able to recognize that they've hybridized with Neanderthals as well.
Okay, so they're on the map before Neanderthal dies off.
Yes, they're simultaneous.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I can't contribute anything to the argument on that.
Okay.
I think this is why it's so good to have these sort of panel discussions, and research together, as you mentioned at the beginning with interdisciplinary work, because, like coming from Peter's perspective, he's not looking at the archaeology, you're not looking as much at the paleoanthropological evidence. And so it's so important that we come together and have these dialogues. And, he's also not a biblical exegete, neither am I in my background. So it's very helpful for you to walk us through Genesis 6 and so on, Maybe we can move on to the next important part in archaeology, and hopefully at some point return to this Genesis 6 discussions. It's so fascinating. And what I initially had contacted you about is the Tower of Babel, because it's this really interesting, important moment. Because you claim to have identified the proper site for the events described in Genesis 11 as the Tower of Babel, as well as the tower itself. So maybe look a bit, how did your background help you to approach this? Because as I was talking to you privately beforehand, you were talking about how you had to approach it both from an exegetical perspective and an archaeological perspective.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just talk about how you came to this in the first place.
And just wearing my exegete's hat, there's really no way I think I could have stumbled upon the right site for Babel of Genesis 11 or the right building that's the tower that we conceive of as the Tower of Babel. But as an archaeologist, I had the potential to be able to stumble into this if I were to find enough evidence, and it would become a trail and it would take me to where that would end up being. And so as an archaeologist, I looked at it from the perspective of what I want to focus on first is this movement of people, not to Babel, but from Babel, what I call the post-Babel dispersion. So if at the time that languages were confused, or that the one universal language ended and universal languages began, multiple languages, and you have an outward expansion of people from that place, then you should be able, you have the potential to find that track movement of the people. Well, thankfully, in my study in my PhD program at the University of Toronto, I took this year-long Mesopotamian archaeology course. And in that course, in the early part of the course, I found out about two and only two outward expansions of people moving from Mesopotamia to other places in the ancient world. Now, an emphasis here is these are movements before, or movements during the prehistorical period. What is our boundary for the prehistorical period? The advent of writing. So it's before the advent of writing. Now, I'm convinced that the events that happen in Genesis 11 are pointing us to, they're pointing us to something that happened in the prehistorical period. Why? Couple reasons. Okay, you look at the event of the flood. Now we have some number, I forget exactly what the number is. It's now over 300 accounts of this story of the, and I'll use the word whether you like it or not, universal flood that took place in antiquity. So many cultures, over 300 cultures, have their own flood story. And all of those stories, the name of the flood, what's called the flood hero in ancient Near Eastern studies, the name of the flood hero changes. What that suggests to me is, well, I asked this question. Well, if the event happened after Babel, then you'd expect that there would be the same name, the same word just kind of transliterated from language to language. But that's not what happens. We find very different names for the flood hero. And that strongly suggests to me that the flood event and the story of it that was passed along orally predated the dispersion of people and the confusing of languages. And
I'm glad you brought up flood legends right now, because I had a question related to this for you. Mm-hmm. So if we kind of think, a lot of cultures also have legends about the division of languages, as you're well aware, I'm sure. So in some of these cases, we have people way out in the Americas or in Polynesia or Australia where, according to dates, it would seem that they would have to have gotten to where they now live or lived before the Uruk expansion, right? So can you kind of talk a little bit about why exactly these people who are way out on these other continents, who never were at Babel and therefore never experienced the division of languages, would have myths about it? Do you think they interacted with people who did, or how do you kind of deal with that?
Well, certainly I would say, the most important point is at the time of the end of the flood event, you only have 8 people alive on the earth. Mm-hmm. And all of those 8 people would carry with them, obviously, the recollection of what just happened on planet Earth, mm-hmm. because it was the most catastrophic event in history. So for that event to spread, it's non-problematic. It's even expected because it's such a major story. I mean, if there were newspapers, it'd be in all the papers, on all of the video channels. Mm-hmm. So that being the case, and given that there clearly was a Pangea, and the Christian community is convinced of this, the non-Christian community is convinced of this, that there was a one world landmass at some point in our history, in Earth's history, going far back. And that's, as you know better than I do, you can prove that by how certain animals and certain plants that are very limited in their habitat, they would connect between Antarctica and the point of Africa, or whatever all of those connection points are, mm-hmm. demonstrating a breaking apart. So in the pre-flood world, in my mind, no doubt about it, Pangea still was in existence. So the question,
you might make a distinction there between Pangea and then what the earlier continent, I think it's Rodinia. Pangea, I think most creation geologists would agree, was formed during the flood by continental movement, actually from the breakup of an even earlier continent.
It sounds like to me they're redefining the term then, because Pangea was always connected with the German term Urkontinent. That was the original term. Okay. Urkontinent, a universal continent.
So it seems that, from my understanding of geology, the continents came together apart multiple times. That's my understanding. Rodinia broke up and then reformed into Pangea during the flood, and then to modern.
Well, I don't know. Maybe that's verifiable, but certainly the earlier use of the term for Pangea was
Okay.
the
I just
equivalent
wanted
of
to be
what
clear
comes.
what you were talking about.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm talking about if there were multiple breakings apart before any of the breakings apart.
Okay.
So clearly that takes place. Where was I going next?
We're discussing the spread of humans.
Yes.
Okay.
In myths about or legends about language.
Yes. That's where it is. So from the different accounts of the flood in different cultures with different names for the flood hero, and the fact that we have such diverse elements that are added to the story or subtracted from the story suggests to us clearly this was in a time of oral transmission, right? Where you have only fragments that make it and new fragments added. And so it's nothing codified. There's nothing written yet. So that's one form of evidence to show. Another form of evidence is the fact that what was I going to say? Lost my train of thought here.
Now, somewhat related to this, kind of your take on Babel, as we'll probably get into a little more in a little while, right? Is that Babel is not universal, right? So, kind of following up on my previous question, about the breakup of languages. Can you kind of address a little more about how exactly people who spread out before the breakup of languages happened have these legends about languages being changed?
Sure. All the accounts we have of in antiquity of the universal language, they're of course only codified in the historical period, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we don't really have a clear trail that we can follow because it's before written history.
Yeah.
There's no clear trail to follow to be able to take us back to physical places where the story took place for this people group or that people group or that kind of thing. But what we have is we have accounts of one example of this. There's an ancient Mesopotamian writing called Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada, which is in Akkadian, and that gives us a window into this time period, and it speaks of how back in much earlier time there was this universal language when all men spoke in one tongue, and then it says, and it attributes the dispersing of languages to the god Enki, right? And that's really important. It's going to take us a while to get there, why it's important, but that's really important. Okay, so let's kind of go from there. How do we get to, as an archaeologist, how do I get to evidence for the Tower of Babel? I look for this outward expansion of people, this movement of people. And in prehistory, there were only two movements, right? Prehistorical times, two movements of people, the Ubaid expansion and the Uruk expansion. And if you look at Mesopotamian archaeological periodization, you can see exactly where this fits into the chronology, period-wise. So there's an expansion of people outward from Mesopotamia in the Ubaid period, and there's an expansion outward in the Uruk period. So for my project, for the course I took, I compared and contrasted those two movements. And I approached it saying, I'm convinced that the flood occurred, that the Tower of Babel events occurred in the prehistorical period. So one of these two outward movements of people almost certainly has to be the post-Babel dispersion. So what kinds of things am I going to find with each expansion of people? And maybe one of them will be the kinds of things I expect if these were people who had their language changed and people who didn't have their language changed, okay? So that being the case, the Ubaid expansion. That expansion can be characterized as a peaceful migration, or a non-intrusive relocation. So they go to sites like Tepe Gara, for example. And at Tepe Gara, we see this slow amalgamation of cultures. So the southern Mesopotamians who moved, and so they're in southern Mesopotamia. The type site for this period is Tel Al-Ubaid. You can look that up. You can Google that, Tel Al-Ubaid. And people moved from southern Mesopotamia to sites way up to the northwest, such as Tepe Gara. And you see this slow infiltrating of cultures and amalgamating of cultures. They quickly appropriated markers of Ubaidian identity in the public domain. So the people who lived in Tepe Gara before these migrants arrived, once the migrants arrived, they quickly incorporated a lot of that culture, that new culture, into their culture. Now, the southern Mesopotamians were much more sophisticated. So the people at Tepe Gara obviously would want to incorporate those elements of sophistication into their culture. So those came quickly. Markers such as artifacts related to religious ideology and temple architecture, they came last. So it's in the religious sphere that you have the last elements of incorporation and harmonization into one. So that shows a peaceful, evidence of a peaceful migration. Then there's another site. It's called Degirmentepe. Degirmentepe is in basically far eastern Anatolia, kind of right on the border of the alongside the Euphrates River, kind of near the mouth of the Euphrates River. And something fascinating happened at Degirmentepe. The people who lived there, who experienced migrants coming from southern Mesopotamia at the time of the Ubaid expansion, those people who moved ended up building houses right next door. So Gideon, I've never owned property in North America, but let's say you have a house and you have just enough property so that if I build my house on your property, I can have my own house. But to do it, we have to build them what's called contiguously. So we have more or less a shared wall. I'm going to build one of my walls right against one of your walls. This is a type of architecture called a contiguous layout. So when the people moved from southern Mesopotamia in the Ubaid expansion, there was all of this contiguous architecture where they were building houses that were abutted right against each other. And what that reflects is a harmony between people, getting along well, and a general peace that exists within both cultures. So those are signs that you would expect of a very normal movement of people, right? But the Uruk expansion is totally different. You have a lot of settlements, for example, on what we call virgin soil. So you have outward movements of people during the outward movement of people in the late Uruk period. You have groups of those people who move to a faraway place and they build a community on virgin soil. What does that suggest to you? Well, if the earlier expansion had pretty much no or very limited amount of settlements on virgin soil, and your expansion has a lot, it would suggest to me maybe it wasn't quite as peaceful. Maybe there was a problem with communication. Well, not only do we have examples of this building on virgin soil, such as Habuba Kabira in ancient Syria, but we have other sites like Hasanebi Tepe, which is also in eastern Turkey, where we have the first example of something that we see occurring in the United States 100 years ago, 200 years ago, maybe 300 years ago, when we start getting different groups of people who move in and start building up a city, right? And so it's New York City or Philadelphia or Boston or something. and all of a sudden a new cultural group comes. Let's say Irish. So a bunch of Irish people get on a couple of boats or whatever, and they go to the west, across the Atlantic, and they go to New York City or Boston or something. Where are they going to live?
Well, they would live in a separate area then.
Exactly. Why? Why would they live in a separate area?
Is they're going to have very different culture and language than the main people.
Exactly. You have a major communication breakdown. The Irish can't communicate with the Germans or with the Polish or with the Czechs or whoever else is there. So what do? You build your own ethnic community. I'm from a Serbian community that was established in many places in the States. Mine is in northeastern Ohio. Serbians all came to one place, and what did? They congregated and stayed together because all they could speak was the Serbian language. Several generations later, obviously, when the offspring and grandchildren come along, they're speaking the native language of all the people around, so you don't have the same problem. But when you have that time where a group of people moves and they can't communicate with somebody, you would expect something like building on virgin soil, or this phenomenon that we know of as segregated living. So the first example we know of in ancient Near Eastern history of segregated living is sites like Hassanebi Tepe, where you have a community already existing, right, far away. You have people, once again, and this is later in time, but a second movement, the Uruk expansion. You have people moving from southern Mesopotamia to northeastern Turkey, Anatolia, and there's already a community there. And what do? They build their own houses in a separate community right next door. So all their houses are together, separate from all of the houses of the native people. And at a site like this, one thing that you see that's fascinating is they even had their own separate trash heaps. They wouldn't even have the same trash dump. What do you do at places like water holes where everybody gets their water, trash dumps? City gates? You talk to one another, communication. So in one of those places where you would have a strong line of communication, such as at a trash heap, no, if you have two different people groups who can't speak the same language, all of a sudden, living in close proximity to one another, they're going to avoid one another all the more because of the language barrier. It naturally pushes us apart from one another. That's what it does. So we have that example. And then we have examples such as Hamukar. Hamukar in Syria, ancient Syria, is there was an established community there of native people. And then people from the Uruk expansion, so from southern Mesopotamia, they invade Hamukar and they destroy the people and parts of the city in an attempt to overthrow it. We don't see this kind of violence with the Ubaid expansion, but we see it with the invasion of Hamukar. There are physical remains of bones all over the place. There are physical remains of slingshot bullets all over the place that had been used to break skulls. There are examples of body parts that have been abused by attackers. So there are lots of examples of warfare that takes place with the Uruk expansion. So all of that suggests that the Uruk expansion is one where it fits the mold of what we would expect for the post-Babel dispersion. Remember, God wants to keep people from committing the kind of atrocious, selfish acts of self-exaltation as we see at Babel. So what does he do? He makes them unable to communicate with one another. And this is what we see reflected in the Uruk expansion. So I'm convinced that the Uruk expansion is the right outward expansion of people that's connected with the post-Babel dispersion.
So stepping backwards just a little bit, What do you kind of think about the various other human species like Homo erectus and others? Would you also say that they were pre-flood as well?
Well, where in time are they living? I don't know.
They're living before Neanderthals.
Okay.
So it would seem you'd have to say they're pre-flood then, right?
Yeah, sure.
But so I guess I'm kind of questioning why exactly it would be that Neanderthals specifically are the Nephilim, because there's a lot of various options, right, for various hominin species. Is it mainly because of the genetics that you think that associate the Neanderthals?
Okay, there's a few things. The physiological difference between them and a standard hominid is very different than with any other ancient remnant of human life that we found.
I wouldn't quite say that. There were other species that were very different as well. I mean, it depends where you're going to go. I mean, Homo heidelbergensis has a lot of similar traits to Neanderthals as well in terms of shortness and stockiness. But there's certainly even more diverse hominin forms, I think.
Yeah. And so the other two main reasons for the hypothesis are the fact that it comes right after the 49,000 BC conventionally dated coal beds, and that they die off in 40,000 BC, and the fact that we have this otherwise inexplicable DNA fact where all the DNA goes through 2 to 3 women.
So I'm not so convinced that that's inexplicable, because from sequencing Neanderthal DNA, we know that they were pretty inbred, at least towards the end of their range, right? So that's one possibility for why towards the end of their range, when they begin to start interbreeding with Homo sapiens, we would expect to see less genetic diversity be transmitted into the Homo sapiens population.
Yeah, but what we're talking about is we're talking about looking back from now to the time of their extinction, right? From now going back until then, all races on Earth, separate races of individuals who have Neanderthal DNA, all can be traced to only 2 or 3 women. So what you're talking about is, so if this is an hourglass, and today we're here, and we go back in time, and there's that bottleneck, you're talking about the time that's in here before the bottleneck. So that I don't see that as an issue.
Okay, so I guess this is where we're going to differ a little bit, because I'm going to say that all of these human fossils are post-flood, and because of the flood boundary. And then I'm going to say, well, I think there's 2 options for me. I would either say that all of these people were at Babel and have a very, very early Babel, and then have all of these different hominin species disperse after that, or possibly that these other human species besides Homo sapiens dispersed before Babel, and then we have a later Babel like the Uruk expansion.
Okay,
Yeah.
I want to come back to your last point, and I'm going to try to I'm going to give you some data that's going to put your perspective kind of a little bit on trial.
Awesome.
Okay.
That sounds good. Yeah, I'm really glad we're having these discussions here. So maybe we get to the site of Babel, right? If you're going to date it to the Uruk expansion, we have to pick a city that's going to be Babel there, right? And a lot of people think, well, this is just Babylon of Daniel, like we see in the book of Daniel, for example. But you think it's not the same city, right? You think it's the city of Eridu, if I recall correctly. So what makes you cite it as Eridu to be?
Okay, so let's start here with our working hypothesis. If the Uruk expansion is indeed the post-Babel dispersion, then we now have a time on a watch when the event of the confusion of languages took place. It happened in the late Uruk period, right?
Yeah.
True? So
Yeah.
that's we want to evaluate this now. So moving forward, if we're going to find the right site, that's the Babel of Genesis 11, there are 2 qualifications that it has to meet. One, it has to be in southern Mesopotamia, because the Ubaid expansion happens not in from central Mesopotamia or from northern Mesopotamia. It happens only from southern Mesopotamia. So our site needs to be in southern Mesopotamia, where the expansion took place from. And two, it needs to, what's the other requirement? I went too far ahead in my mind. The other requirement, sorry about this.
See, I think it's that you has to be called, there has to be a reason, right, that it's named Babylon.
Yeah, right. Has to be before Babylon and, or before. Okay. So let me go this route. So you have to find, so it has to be a site. Here it is. It has to be a site that was inhabited during the Late Uruk period. So it has to be in southern Mesopotamia, and it has to have material culture from the Late Uruk period community. Now, if you look at the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's day, the Babylon of Daniel's day, there's a big problem here. That site of Babylon was not inhabited during the Late Uruk expansion, during the Late Uruk period. Its advent, its founding came after that. So that's a huge problem. It doesn't fit the history at all. Mm-hmm. Well, there's an article that a Cambridge scholar named Stephanie Daly published some years ago, not that many, but some years ago. That's a really important article in all of this. And what she did is she collected data. What she did is she looked for as many sites as she could find that in antiquity, at one point or another, they were called Babel. Maybe she found, stumbled into 2 or 3 and figured, I want to search this out. And so she did. She found 8 sites, total of 8 sites that were called Babel in antiquity. Now, for example, the city in the United States, the city of New York, where does new, we understand, is new as opposed to old, but where does York come from?
England.
Yeah,
well,
the UK. It's from England.
UK, yeah.
Yep. So that's common throughout history to name a new site after a previous site. So we can understand why there are 8 Babels. That makes sense. There are multiple uses of various Antioch, the city of Antioch. There are numerous Antiochs in the ancient world. There's not just one. So and other cities, Thebes. There are multiple places where you have a city of Thebes. Well, the question then is, among these 8, which ones of them fit the criteria? Which ones of them are in southern Mesopotamia and have a material cultural footprint that includes the late Uruk period? In other words, they were inhabited at the time of the expansion. Well, you can evaluate all 8 sites. Only one of them meets both criteria, and that's Eridu. Eridu is called in the Sumerian king list the first city after the flood. It's the first city after the flood. Or wait, is it even the first city before the flood? It's got cities before the flood and cities after the flood. And in respect to one, it's the first city, maybe even be the one before the flood. But anyway, it's called the first city, and it's the city of Enki. Enki is the patron deity there. Enki is the god of what's called the sweet water Apsu in Sumerian culture. That means that the underground aquifers, the places where fresh water exists under the surface of the earth, this god Enki, he's the god who's sovereign over all of those subterranean aquifers. Isn't that amazing? That's the patron god of Eridu. So if Eridu is the only city that meets the criteria, then of course the spotlight needs to go on Eridu. So I put the spotlight on Eridu. It took me a while, but I found a copy of the archaeology that was done by a team in the 80s and published in, I think, 1986. And in that volume, they go into great detail about all that they discovered in their excavation there. And in their excavation, among other things that they found there, they found I think it was a sequence of 18 temples that were built essentially on top of one another, and they just increased and improved as they went, and increased in their size. Eventually, they came to have what's called a tripartite building, and the tripartite building became famous and universal throughout the ancient Near East at the time of the Late Uruk period and the subsequent periods after that. If you go into the Levant, now you're at the end of the Chalcolithic period, and then you move into the Bronze Age. And throughout the Bronze Age, the early, middle, and Bronze Ages, you have tripartite buildings. The Israelites eventually, actually it's early in their history, as my second book proves, the Israelites modify the tripartite building and they turn it into what's called a 4-room house. We see these in the Iron Age, so that's 1200, after 1200 BC. We see them all over the place throughout the land of Israel, these 4-room houses. We also see one dating to the 19th century BC, right at the time of Jacob's lifetime in Egypt, at the site of Avaris, the oldest 4-room house in history. And I document that and discuss it. And I suggest to the reader that this is the very house of Jacob himself when he moved his family to Avaris. Now, there's a lot of detail that goes into that. It's all in the book. I can't go into it now. But all of this is based on the tripartite building that is developed at Eridu. It's in the temple architecture. Temples after that were typically tripartite. The Solomonic temple, how is it built architecturally? Tripartite. That same model. The temple in Herod's day that Jesus knew, tripartite. It all goes back to Eridu. That's the model that was followed. So in the last several phases of the temple, it was gigantic. But what the archaeologists found was that not only in the last 2 phases was the temple at its largest, but adjacent to the temple, they built a platform. And the platform was so big that it dwarfed the otherwise, for its day, giant temple in its final 2 phases. So they build the platform. What do they build on top of the platform? On top of the platform, they start to build a structure, very massive structure that's built up. At some point along the way, it was stopped. They never finished the building. The city of Eridu was what's the term for when everybody leaves the city?
Abandoned.
Thank you. The city of Eridu was abandoned in the late Uruk period. In the Jemdet Nasr period, which is the next archaeological phase, nobody lives at Eridu. Only in a much later phase do you start seeing people show up again at Eridu. Here's what else you find. The structure that was partially built during the late Uruk period, it was completed, but only much later, in Abraham's lifetime, by the king of Ur, who was the world leader of the day. He was the most powerful man on the earth. He was the empire builder who had the empire that dominated the ancient Near East, especially Mesopotamia. So the 3rd dynasty of Ur, that's the time frame. And it's, I think it's Naram Sin, who is the king who's on the throne, who decides, I'm sick of that dilapidated building that never got finished at Eridu, which is not far away from Ur. Our city here in Ur is beautiful and gorgeous, and we need to fix that. So what he did is he ordered that structure to be completed. He started building it up until he had a complete building, and that is a ziggurat. And the bricks have his name inscribed right on them, or imprinted right on them. So he completed the building of that tower. But the archaeologists wanted to know, at the time they didn't know yet, when that earlier structure, that earlier ziggurat that never was completed, when it was built. So they went down into the foundational trenches and they found pits there. And in those pits, they found 4 lug jars, beveled rim bowls, and stone mosaic cones. All of those are diagnostic features of one period and one period only. And that is the late Uruk period. It was founded, it began to be built in the late Uruk period. The city clearly was abandoned in the late Uruk period. So what does that tell us? We've got all of the essential parts of the puzzle that fit with Eridu. It fits biblically with the text, and it fits archaeologically with being inhabited at the right period of time and abandoned at the right period of time, with a largest building, the ziggurat, which was left uncompleted and only was completed later.
Could you comment a little bit? You're talking a little bit about the expansion of architecture from Eridu. Could you comment on like Mesoamerican pyramids, right? They have a similar structure, and many people have theorized that they kind of stem back to the same thing. But in your view, the Mesoamericans would have had to reach that location in America, right, before Babel happened. So where would you kind of explain the origin of that sort of architecture? Is this just something pre-flood, or is it just that these two different people groups happen to stumble upon the same sort of architecture?
Yeah, and I would connect the post-Babel dispersion with, okay, so they're taking with them all of what they know. And by the way, before I get further to your question, there was one thing that they were on the cusp of doing at the time of the late Uruk expansion. They didn't quite get there, but they were on the cusp of it. And that's the advent of writing. Mm-hmm. They were already, there were the precursors to it. It started with writing down on clay, on clay tablets. So accountants were the first people who actually wrote something. It wasn't language codified, right? So it wasn't text, but they were writing down on these clay tablets, and they were turning them into envelopes and putting counters in them. They would have counters to designate, ones and tens and hundreds and whatever, so that if we're trading, my barley for your goats or something, and this transaction happens and we want to codify it, we put markers into this clay envelope and we seal it, right? And we hold it in an inventory, and it represents a record, or a verifiable record of the transaction that took place between us, 5 years ago or something. So all of these records are codified. In what they were doing on writing on the outsides of these tablets, right at the time of the Uruk expansion, we see all of the precursors to writing. We see the same kinds of vertical wedges that show up in the first and the oldest script that's from Mesopotamia, known as the cuneiform script. There were also pictographs. They were drawing pictures of things on the outsides of these clay envelopes. And that, of course, is the precursor to hieroglyphic, the hieroglyphic script, which is what? It's nothing but 800 plus pictographs, which finds its root in the material culture of the people at Eridu and the surrounding area at the time of the late Uruk expansion. So all of the building blocks for language are already there. They're just right on the cusp of creating a written script itself. And what happens? Bam! Everybody leaves town. What we know in tracing their outward movement is, it's kind of like if you were to go to a pond and it's completely still, and you take a big rock and you heave it as far as you can, you're going to see that the most amount of, if you will, damage is going to be really close to where the rock hits. And the further you get away from it, the less ripple effect that it has, right? So the nearest city to Eridu, the nearest major city is, and by the way, Eridu wasn't the only city of its time, and it wasn't the first actual city. It's it depends how you define that. It wasn't the first community. There were lots of communities in many different periods before this. it's a misconception to think that all of the other communities and towns and cities that were developed happened because everybody came to one place and everybody on earth lived in the same city. That's an absolute utter misconception, and the biblical text doesn't say that. Peter Wise, bless his heart, he thinks that's true. It's not. The Bible does not say that. It says that all of the people spoke one language. That it does say in Genesis 11:1, but it never says all of the people gathered together in one place. This is just one place where they did gather together. And it doesn't even say it's immediately after the flood. There's no indication of the time frame there. So it just so happens that there are lots of archaeological periods and subphases before the later root period. So
although creationists have attempted to connect it through Peleg, of course, based on his name, right? Meaning in his days, the earth was divided.
Yeah.
So there's some way to date that biblically.
Yes. And I agree with that.
Okay.
I'm 100% on board with that Genesis 10 reference being a foreshadowing of what we see in Genesis 11.
Okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, there's a literary tool that Moses uses in the book of Genesis over and over and over. And that is, and I don't know if there's a name for it, but what he does is he lays out a swath of time. And it can be, hundreds of years of time, whatever. And he gives the kind of the quick summary of all of that. And what he's going to do next is, with what follows the end of that, he's going to go back into that period of time that he just kind of quickly ran through the highlights. And he's going to zero in. So it's a zoom lens. He zooms in on one specific point and illuminates it, right? He does this over and over and over in the book of Genesis. And this is one of those places. Genesis 11 fits into the genealogy and the history that's recorded in Genesis 10. And Nimrod, that we haven't got to yet, he fits in that same category. So he's much later, but he fits into the general scope of things that's recorded in Genesis 10. So yeah, in the days of Peleg, that is when the earth is divided. And what it's talking about clearly is the division of people. It's not talking about a geological division of, chunks of the earth. So this isn't the breaking up of Pangea in Genesis 10. That's a misconception that a lot of evangelicals have. That's just completely mistaken.
So can you kind of talk a little bit about your perspective, right? Your perspective is that Babel is not universal. There's a selective group of people who end up at Babel, and much of the world has already dispersed by the time that Babel happens. Now, you kind of mentioned a lot of people will typically think that Babel was universal because there's a language about the whole earth having one language. Can you talk a little bit about how later in the text it's referring back to those people, right? And it's talking about how those people migrated to the land of Shinar from the east. Yeah. So do you think there's not a case for that word there referring back to the whole earth?
No. Okay. No. That is an earlier detail that is preparing you for an entire story. That's the magnification of what we read about with the division in Peleg's day, right?
Okay.
So the beginning of the story is to let the reader know, because remember, in Moses' day, none of his readers is familiar with a world where there's a universal language, right? So he needs to impress the point on them. This was at a time when all people spoke the same language. You need to know that. That's essential to the story. So he gives them that detail and says, all of the people of the earth spoke one language. And then he says, now it came about as, in their moving from the east. And that's what it says, from the east. So it was a westward movement from the east, clearly, that all of these things and so forth took place. So, there's nothing in the text that tells you that all of the people were gathered there.
So kind of based on this, what we have, right, is you have people who would have already spread out, who had the same language then, and then you have a new wave of people that has diverse languages. So based on that, kind of model, then should we expect that like people out in like Polynesia and Australia, and then people in the Americas should be tied back to a similar language back at this particular time? So we should see that them kind of on the same branch of kind of the language tree, because they go before the new languages arise.
Let's ask this question. Along what lines did God confuse the languages? Along what lines?
Well, most people are going to say it's the people who are at Babel.
Okay.
Are you going to say it's the whole earth?
Let's think a little
Okay.
deeper.
Okay.
I mean, what do you think then? Basically, like there's people living in the Americas who have the same language, and then the languages are confused. So then it's confused over in the Americas as well at the same time.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the answer to the question is the confusion of languages takes place along familial lines. So wherever you were on the earth, God divided your language so that you could speak to your family, right? He kept families together. And that's what God does throughout the Bible. He keeps families together. So the division of language was according to your familial lines. Let me try to prove this to you. A lot of people have this very romantic idea. I love romanticism, don't get me wrong. They have this romantic idea that Hebrew is the universal language that went from Adam all the way until our day today, right? That's very romantic. There's nothing in the text at all that suggests that's true. So what is the language connected with Abram's family? Well, first of all, what is Abram's family? If we look at when Abram is introduced in the Bible, it says that he was of a certain family. Abram the what?
Hebrew.
Wow, Abram the Hebrew. So what that's telling us is, the Hebrews don't start with Jacob. They don't start with Isaac. They don't even start with Abram. They start with somebody earlier. Well, if you look at the triconsonantal root, the Hebrew root, it's connected to a certain name, Eber. You find him in Genesis 10. That's exactly the same root. And that's the equivalent in Akkadian of Heber. H-B-R. We know of ancient people called the Habiru. The Habiru people are the same family as the Hebrews. It's just spoken in two different languages. The term. It's kind of like, when I lived in Russia, people who lived in Moscow weren't Muscovites, as we would say in English. They were Moskvichi. Two different languages to say the same thing. So, so all that's the same. Okay, where am I going next?
So you're kind of talking about how these different people, right, they must have had their languages confused all across the earth.
Yes.
To me, that seems somewhat theologically problematic, because God then has to be punishing all of these different people for sins that for this thing that they didn't actually do, right? Because the confusion of languages is really just to stop these people from building the tower and to get them to spread out. Well, all these other people on the other side of the earth have already spread out, and they're not looking for a name trying to build a name for themselves. So why would God punish them in this sense by dividing their languages?
Okay, let me show you the futility of your own argument there.
All right.
No offense. The very thing that you want to be true there at Babel is not true at the flood, is it? It's not true.
Wait.
Everybody pays the price. Everybody dies, even if you were godly. Even now, Enoch, I think, was gone by then. But even if you have other Enochs on the earth, they have no chance.
I guess I'm not convinced that there were other godly people, because like Methuselah and the other patriarchs die towards the beginning of the flood.
I don't know that.
I don't know though.
We can't prove that there were no godly people.
Yeah.
We can't prove that there were no godly people.
No.
And I think it would be reading into the text to say there couldn't have been any.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, there could have been. So there are innocents are perishing in a sense. Okay, not every person on the earth is part of this deal where the sons of God go into the daughters of mankind, right? Many people aren't watching this and applauding. They may be grieved by it, but they die in the flood too.
So, you know, you're never going to see the situation where only the innocents suffer. David's sin against Bathsheba and her husband, whom he had killed, right? David didn't just suffer from that. His whole family and the whole nation suffered from that.
Yeah.
So the effects are going to be broad.
So do you think there's evidence of this kind of division in languages in these other like more remote places where it would have had to happen?
But remember, if God indeed is dividing only according to familial lines, then it doesn't matter geographically where you're standing on the planet Earth. All that matters is that you're of that family. And that family gets the same language. That family member gets the same language as every other family member he has, no matter where his other family member is.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there would be like cultural divisions, right? Because you're saying there's these cultural divisions where people are more at strife with each other, and we can see this in the ways that they're interacting, right? So are there similar things like separate garbage dumps after a certain point in other areas?
Sure.
Like in the Americas? Are you aware of that?
Well, I guess I didn't, I haven't done any archaeology work in the Americas, so I can't really tell you on that.
Okay.
I'd be surprised if there weren't, but, again, you only have that dynamic where there was a pre-existing culture. And then at the time of the language confusion, you have somebody moving to there and living among them next door or in the same community. And that's where you have the separate trash dump. So you'd have to have that kind of same dynamic going on.
Sure, but you would still have the fracturing of the culture, whatever it would be in Mesoamerica and South Central, and yeah.
Sure, right, and you may have people who were in a certain place somewhere around the globe who were not exactly of the same family, who were living in the same place, and their languages were divided. So yeah, I'm suggesting to you that it happened universally around the entire Earth, with every cultural group at the same time, and it was all a division on familial lines only. And that's why we have Abram being called a Hebrew. What is that division according to? It's going according to Aber, and it's his family line that we see, moving out. And so Eber and Joktan, they're all part of that Eberite family line. So they're all Hebrews, and they're all speaking the same language. And that's Hebrewese or Habiruese or whatever you want to call it. That's the language that they're speaking.
One question I have, Peter brought up the sort of archaeological evidence we might find from this division. One thought that just popped into my mind would be trade, right? So it seems like if people early on are living for hundreds of years, and they all speak the same language, and they're already as far as the Americas, I would expect there would be trade, right? So if you could get back and forth from America, even if it took you a dozen years or so, it seems like people would want to make money off that sort of trade, right? They discover new foods in the Americas that are not in, say, Asia. And so they might want to do that sort of trade. And when we have this division of language, then, people are quite adept at trading when they do not have the same language, we've discovered, from what I can tell. But it seems like there would be a breakdown in global trade networks. So do we at all find any sort of evidence of a breakdown of trade networks in the ancient world from the pre-historical period?
Well, that's a good question. I'll say this, for sure, what we see in the generations that follow, in the periods that follow, we see an increase or an influx in trading that it hadn't seen before, the world hadn't seen before. It's not visible. So it clearly peaks, quickly moves toward a peak in the periods that follow, for sure.
In your example with the Americas, I don't really think that was the case, mainly because it seems that there were only a certain number of times when there were really major migrations into the Americas. So I don't think that was happening regularly. That might have had to do with the climate at the time, and also obviously with kind of the straits, the Bering Straits, and the situation with the land bridge there.
Right. Yeah. And with the Americas, now you're talking about a completely different element, which is this breaking apart of Pangaea and the actual physical movement of continents to the places where they inhabit now. So yeah, at some point or another, they became too far apart from one another with the current technology to be able to comfortably reach one another. So, that would account for the lack of
Yeah. All right. I don't know if there's any other question to ask, but the last thing I was thinking is we are getting quite long, and I told you guys it was 2 hours, and now we're at 2.5 hours, and I don't want to take your whole days away from you. But the last thing I thought we could ask about was Nimrod, right? Because we sort of skipped over him in the story, because he comes in the order of the text before Babel, and a lot of people date him as before Babel or somehow being involved in the construction of Babel. Versus you date him afterwards to Sargon of Akkad, the historical figure, not the internet personality, of course. And so, sort of what things lead you to having it be Sargon? And then also on that note, I read through your paper on it being Sargon. You interacted and I think did a good job refuting other theories. But one you didn't mention was the idea of Enmerkar being Nimrod. So if you could interact with that theory as well.
Sure. So I'm convinced that we can identify Nimrod with a historical personage, and that personage is Sargon of Akkad. He's the world's first empire builder. So the Akkadian Empire is what he built. We know that that he was from the city of Kish, which, by the way, is an exact, with a consonantal structure, it's an exact equivalent of what we read about, the term we read in the Bible in Genesis 10, where we find Nimrod's story, where it says that the sons of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ra'amah, Sabteka, while the sons of Ra'amah were Sheba and Dedan. Now Cush sired Nimrod. So the word Cush there is the exact same consonantal structure as Kish, and that's where Sargon comes from. A lot of times people want to connect Cushites with Africa. It's possible that some Cushites, some descendants of Cush, migrated to Africa. Not a problem. But it would be wrong to say that the true beginning of the Cushites was Africa. No, it was in the area of Mesopotamia. So Kish, which is located in southern Mesopotamia, that's where Sargon is from. So if the people, the main tribe or whatever, the main descendants of Kish, or a major group of descendants of Kish moved to the city of Kish, it fits that Sargon comes from there genealogically. Okay, so that's one important note to make. The next is in verse 8, when it says, now Cush sired Nimrod. Clearly, Nimrod is not part of the exact genealogy just given in verse 7. Nimrod is not one of the sons of Cush. Nimrod is not named as one of the grandsons of Cush. He is not part of that early physical connection to Cush himself. So, that being true, the Hebrew word for the verb for siring essentially means that you are if not father, it could be father, doesn't have to be father. It could be you are the forefather. That's the idea. And it's used in such terms throughout the Bible. So there are descendants of much earlier people who are called, this guy is called the son of this guy who is 17 generations earlier. So it's not problematic at all that Nimrod would be not a son or grandson of Cush. In fact, you'd expect he's not, because he's not in that list in Genesis 10:7, but instead he is a descendant of Cush. So Cush was the predecessor. Cush was the forefather of Nimrod. So technically, you can use the verb sire, and that's the verb I prefer. Cush sired Nimrod. So Nimrod was one of the eventual offspring of Cush. Then the text goes on to say, that one, meaning that person, meaning Nimrod, because the whole point is to get to Nimrod. That one, meaning Nimrod, acted irreverently in order to become powerful on earth. So, we talked before about this word. In the next verse, he became a powerful slaughterer, right? So the word for powerful, Nimrod is called a Gibor. That's the same word that's used of the sons of God. And they're very evil. So whatever he's doing, it could be good, it could be evil, only the context will tell us. But he's powerful. That's clear. Well, what do powerful people usually do on the earth? He became a powerful slaughterer in the sight of he who is. Wow. What does that mean? It means he became a killer of many people. He wasn't just a bad guy. He would wipe out people. That's true of Nimrod. What's true of Sargon of Akkad? Sargon of Akkad was the first empire builder. How did he build an empire? He went from city-state to city-state to city-state, and he conquered one after the other. He invaded the city if he could. He besieged the city if he could, if he needed to, and he would wipe out people, and he would depict all of this in what's referred to as iconography. There are pictures of what he did, showing his captives in nets, showing his captives having been stomped upon, floating in water, suggesting that they're dead. All this imagery showing all of the terrible things that happened to those that he suppressed. So what's true of Sargon is true of Nimrod. He became a powerful slaughterer in the sight of he who is. How big are their kingdoms? Where are their kingdoms? Where do their kingdoms start? Verse 10. Now the starting point of his kingdom, Nimrod's kingdom, was Eridu. And by the way, the fact that he has a kingdom is really big and huge in all of this. What does that mean? It means he's a king, which means he does what? He rules a kingdom, which at least consists of one city-state, if not more. Now, back in the days of Cush, back in the days of Cush's sons, back in the days of Cush's grandsons, we didn't have kings. You only have kings when you have urban cultures. And I'm convinced that urbanization begins at Eridu. All of the signs of urbanization, the telltale signs of urbanizing. You have a strong central authority. You have a leader, usually in the form of a king. You have canalization, which we know of as sewage system. You have public officials. You have city works, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these are telltale signs of civilization and of a truly, if you will, civilized city. Eridu's the first one. And so you have to have kings who rule city-states or beyond. So they have to have a kingdom. And Nimrod is said to have become a powerful, to have a powerful kingdom on the earth. Okay, that doesn't happen 2 generations after the flood, folks. No. So that's all the more argument or evidence screaming out at us that Nimrod is not a contemporary of Cush and his sons or grandsons. He's someone who comes much later. So where was his kingdom? The starting point was Eridu. Now, that's my translation. The Hebrew word is Babel. And that's our friend again. Remember the 8 cities in antiquity that were called Babel? It doesn't tell us which one it was for sure. But what we know about the kingdom of Sargon of Akkad is he came from Kish. Where's Kish? It's not central Mesopotamia. It's not southern Mesopotamia. It's southern Mesopotamia. So Eridu is also in southern Mesopotamia. And then next is the city of Uruk, and then the city of Akkad. So Uruk also is in southern Mesopotamia. It's really close to the Persian Gulf. So if Moses was writing a list here of cities, and he was starting at Daniel's Babylon. If he were to go to Uruk next, he has to go way to the south. And then Akkad is next. Akkad is really close to Daniel's Babylon. So we go way back north. So is it conceivable that Moses would write a list in such a way that it's so terribly drawn out geographically or geopolitically that he's going from here to here to here and then further up? No, it makes no sense at all. Look at the borders of the Promised Land in, what is it? Numbers 34, I think it is. He goes from point to point to point on the western border, on the northern border, on the eastern border, on the southern border, one at a time. It's clear, it's defined, it's calculated. So it's much more plausible that the first city where his kingdom started was not Babylon of Daniel's day in central Mesopotamia, but Eridu of southern Mesopotamia. Why does that make sense? Because at that time, it's a city in southern Mesopotamia that's now been re-inhabited, right? Remember, there's this long period where it goes uninhabited, Eridu. It's been re-inhabited, and it just so happens that Eridu is the beginning of Sargon of Akkad's kingdom. So we go from Eridu, if that's right for Babel, to Uruk, to Akkad, and that's in central Mesopotamia. And all of them are located in the land of Shinar. So all of those cities are in Shinar. From Daniel's Babylon and Akkad in the north to the earlier Babylon, Babel, which is Eridu, Uruk, Ur, all of those cities. So he starts his kingdom in the south, and his kingdom expands northward. And that's very logical. That's very much in harmony with what you'd expect in the ancient world. You have this movement of a spread of an empire in a logical direction. It goes to the north. All of them are in Shinar. And then it says, verse 11, from that land, from Shinar, he went out to Assyria. Where's Assyria? It's further north. So we continue this logical progression of moving from south to north. And he built up Nineveh, Rehoboth city, and Kalhu, and Rezin, being located between Nineveh and Kalhu, which is the great city. So what Sargon does is he starts his empire in southern Mesopotamia. It spreads to central Mesopotamia. It spreads to Assyria. That's what Sargon does. He conquers all of those cities, which makes him an evil person, because to conquer these cities, he's not going up to the city, knocking on the door and saying, would you mind submitting yourself to me? I will give you benevolent rule. He doesn't do that. He invades, he kills, he probably, his troops probably rape, and they take over cities and move on and absorb one city after another into his empire. And it all continues in a northward progression, concluding in northern Assyria, and that's exactly what you'd expect. Well, guess what? Sargon of Akkad has the exact same biography. His kingdom starts in southern Mesopotamia, moves to central Mesopotamia, and then progresses on into Assyria, and he captures the cities that are up in Assyria, and cities such as Tel Leilan, Tel Mozan. All of these cities are part of the empire that he builds. So clearly, the best and most ideal candidate for Nimrod is Sargon of Akkad.
I found your paper on that very convincing. And I thought it was very interesting, especially kind of his relation to Cush and all of that, and him being a later figure, because in my view, Homo sapiens may not have been the first human species. And in my view, it may have even originated after the flood. And in that case, that would be interesting, right, to have a dispersion through the family of Cush, and then later through kind of Nimrod for the dispersion of Homo sapiens.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah, that was very interesting. And I too found your paper very convincing on this point as well. And I don't know this time period very well. So, I can read your paper and be convinced, but I don't have much background on the subject. So before maybe we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to mention about this pre-Abrahamic period? Any other important archaeological points?
Yeah, well, I don't know. An archaeological point doesn't come to mind, but two things do come to mind. One, I'm writing one of the books I'm writing now. It's not the one that will be done next, but it will be done third with where I'm at now in my writing of books. But I have several chapters written, two written on the connecting Eridu with the Tower of Babel events, and one chapter on Nimrod and several others. But I'm writing this book on third millennium biblical history. It's never really been attempted by someone who is let's say a Christian scholar who is a chronologist and historian. Nobody has attempted this kind of book before. I do have a friend who's writing a book at the same time. He may beat me to press. I don't know, Henry Smith. But if he doesn't beat me to press, this will be the first book of its kind. But it will be on biblical history that attempts to connect what we read about in the text with what we see in the archaeological and historical record. Hopefully that book will be out in several years. And then the other thing to mention is that all of my journal articles that I've published are available for free download from my academia.edu webpage. So all you have to do is Google, just write in academia.edu space, my name, Douglas Petrovich, enter, and the first link that you'll come to will take you right to my academia.edu webpage. And all of my articles are there. I have lots of teaching resources, book reviews I've done, interactions with several scholars on several topics, lots of things up there that are free and downloadable. You can just pull them down. I'd suggest everyone to be a part of academia.edu because there are wonderful resources out there by scholars, Christian and secular alike. And they're in many cases, these are peer-reviewed articles and other important sources that they've prepared that they're uploading for free for people to download. So you can have a wealth of great reading and learning that can come through academia.edu.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to your book. Overall, I think what's important here is our development of this understanding of these various historical periods and how they connect towards each other. And in future, this is going to have to be a continuing place of research for creationists to understand how paleoanthropology and archaeology connect. And undoubtedly, a very crucial part of that, as we kind of saw today, is geology and where exactly the flood boundary is.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely a place with greater research is needed. And
One thing I found, I think one of the best accomplishments in creationism was the RAPE project, where we had a large amount of funding and we brought all these experts in different fields together. You brought people who studied physics, you brought people who studied carbon dating, you brought geologists, you brought Hebrew exegetes, and they all came together and approached this problem of how do we deal with radiometric dating. And they didn't solve all the problems, but they sort of hit the first nail, of like trying to solve this issue and really getting to it. And I think there really needs to be a post-flood period, like from the time of the flood to Abraham, study of something like the RAPE project, where we managed to bring scholars together from different fields, have good funding for this. If anyone out there who's watching this stream somehow actually is super rich and would like to fund this, please reach out to us to do that. But I think this is really the next step that needs to be done. This is why I was so excited to organize this discussion panel. I thank you both for coming on and bringing your expertise to this. I think there really needs to be more of a dialogue on this issue between different fields.
Yeah, fully agreed, Gideon. And that's how we're going to progress a lot further, a lot faster. Getting as many people together in the same room and working through these issues together. And who knows, Peter, maybe I will want to have you help me with a chapter or two in that book.
Well, I definitely like to stay in contact. I have some more questions for you. So
sure, absolutely.
Yeah. And I also mentioned as a note at the end here, my own work in studying theology. I'm still just a student yet. I wouldn't title theologian or anything, but in studying theology, even within where I work in more systematic theology, the biblical text, of course, is our source for this theology. And and understanding the biblical text, this historical context can be very helpful. So to give one example, whether Babel or Nimrod comes first could be important to how we understand the structure of the book of Genesis. So I've been very convinced by a structure for Genesis put forward by Peter Leithart. But one point of his structure, it seems to suggest, and I don't know if it only needs to work literarily or also in history, that Nimrod comes before Babel. And so now we have to ask, well, if the evidence is showing the other way, how does that affect our understanding of the literary structure of Genesis? And then how does that help us understand the theology of Genesis? And I don't have an answer to that question. I'm still trying to think through and see if I can come up with maybe some answers for myself on this.
And can I throw something out there, Gideon, on that?
What?
Okay, I think we have a big problem if we put Nimrod before the Tower of Babel. Why? The Tower of Babel gives us the origin of, as I mentioned, civilization. So this is the start of urbanization, at least, if you will. It's the first true city as we understand and define what a city, what I think what a city is. That being the case, how could Nimrod already have a kingdom and expand his kingdom to take over other kingdoms? How can we have that before there's ever the first urbanized city? Where
that would be another point.
Right. So there are all kinds of inherent massive problems in this, I think, historically, if you're going to try to put Nimrod before the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. And that's why it's so helpful to have this historical context, for understanding the biblical text.
Yep.
All right, so maybe we can wrap up then on that note. I thank you both so much for coming on. Both of you are welcome back anytime if you have any new projects you're doing and would like to talk about them. So you can start with Dr. Petrovich for closing, since you're a real special guest here. Is there anywhere people can find you afterwards? You mentioned academia. Is there anything else you would like to plug?
So at my academia.edu webpage is the best place. You can find me on Twitter. You can just Google my name and find my Twitter account. You're welcome to follow me. And I'm constantly trying to post things related to ancient historical studies and some of the study I do and so forth. I just posted that I'm starting actually Monday night. I'm going to be teaching an ancient history course. You're welcome to take that as an adjunct, or not an adjunct, as a auditor for a very nominal fee. I'm teaching it through Brooks Bible College. You're welcome to do that. You can find me also on LinkedIn. So those are the places where I can be found.
Thank you. And Peter, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can just find me over on my YouTube channel, Paleologos, and you can also find some of the articles I write on the New Creation blog as well.
All right. Thank you both for coming on, and thank you everyone so much for watching. People know where they can find me here on YouTube and on Twitter. And if you'd like to support my work, you can support this YouTube channel on Patreon. And also please support the work Dr. Petrovich is doing by buying his books. And thank you everyone so much for watching, and God bless.